a lot harder for kids than it is for the people in it because of the sheer number of adjustments. So people will feel a tremendous amount of guilt, shame, regret. Those are often primary emotions.
Hi, Dr. Ramani. I'm wondering if we can start with an encouraging story about divorce. Do you have any of those?
We often don't hear the words encouraging and divorce in the same sentence. There's lots of them. Kyle, I think that, listen, we're in an era where people are living longer, where people are growing in much more complicated ways over the span of their lives, and people can grow into different directions. And so in those cases, people might recognize actually we'll be better in our own lives, maybe even for each other and perhaps even for children, if we're not attempting to sort of stay in the same place. So can I think of an encouraging story about divorce? I can think of lots of them, actually lots. Stories I've seen in my practice, stories I've seen in my friends. And what leads me to think that these are encouraging stories is I watch people sort of almost pull out of the mess of the divorce, the friendship, the collective sense that these children are, and typically it was because, listen, I'm going to be frank with you. When people get divorced, when they don't have kids, they are more likely to go their separate ways. But in many cases, in all the cases I can think of, the folks had children. Both people were healthy enough people, and they were there. They would still show up to the soccer games together. They would smile together at the graduations. They'd catch up and be quite solicitous of each other. And if something was wrong, they would check in. They would wish each other a happy Father's Day and Mother's Day. Listen, I'm going to be honest with you. Yesterday morning, the first person I said happy Father's Day to was my ex, because he's obviously going to be the first person I thought of. And so I think that there's a lot of encouraging stories about divorce where people are actually able to live authentically, be the parents they want to be, and still cultivate a friendship and actually really cheerlead the other even as they enter sort of new relationships and create this concept of a blended family. So I actually think that divorce can sometimes allow people to sort of live more truly as who they are. So yeah, there's lots of them.
Conversely, what do you think the hardest thing is about this situation?
Divorce is difficult, Kyle. I'd put there as a stressor, I'd put it up there, right up there with death and taxes. Nobody gets married with the plan of dismantling it, right? You've made this commitment. You have intermingled a life. You have perhaps built a family. You might own a home together. This is a life together. And cutting apart a life that's been put together, especially when there are legal and perhaps even spiritual ties associated with that, you see tremendous grief. You will see people who might feel disillusioned or a sense of regret, people who will feel that they've made a huge mistake. It's so interesting, Kyle, even now, 2024 and forward, we still see lots of shame around divorce. Divorce still sort of tracks in the failure column for people. It's not a failure. I think that actually having the sense to recognize that something may not be working and probably needs to be dismantled might be the hardest thing a person has to do. But it's a loss. It's grief. It's the loss of a narrative. It's the loss of an idea that you were going to grow old with someone that you thought you were going to grow old with. It's also the grief around your children's lives, especially if they're minor children, has just become easier. And even if they're not minor children, these are children who now are in the uncomfortable position of having to make choices around holidays, and they often have to split their time. It logistically, I actually think in many ways divorce can be a lot harder for kids than it is for the people in it because of the sheer number of adjustments children often have to make in these circumstances. So people will feel a tremendous amount of guilt, shame, regret. Those are often primary emotions. And then there are practical issues, Kyle. Divorce often sets people back financially, and this often affects women disproportionately. So you'll see people who are now maybe going into the later years of their lives without as much resource. You will see that it can affect things like housing, and people are now maybe living in situations that are not as good or even as safe as they once were. And then when we go into other sorts of cultural things, that people will find that culturally this was unacceptable in their culture that someone gets divorced, and for their reasons they did, but they might find themselves having the experience of feeling more shunned culturally, of feeling that they no longer have a safe space within their spiritual or religious community. So I really do think that the tendrils and the shock waves of what divorce does in a person's life can be quite catastrophic. And then Kyle, the final point is that not all divorce stories are encouraging. And when they are, for example, when there are issues like domestic abuse or intimate partner violence involved, when there's toxic personalities and antagonism involved, you can be talking about processes that are so protracted and so abusive that they can wipe out a person's finances to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars, that they can result, honestly, in post-traumatic stress sorts of reactions. I mean, you can really see rather severe sorts of fallout from divorce too. And I think, like everything, when we talk about mental health and relationships, it's on a continuum, right? And in some cases, it goes smoothly and people really come to a resolution and are able to retain ties. And at the most far end, the most severe end, you're talking about situations where there'll be severe psychological or physical harm.
In this step, we are evaluating what has happened to us. We're going to talk about introspection and retrospection in just a minute. But a lot of people, Dr. Ramani, go, I don't need to evaluate it. I've been evaluating it for the last 5 years. Why do I have to do this? I'm going to skip to step 2. Why is this step, this evaluation, critical for the overall healing journey?
Because in general, when we evaluate something at a certain point in time, as time changes, it's like a forever kind of, shaping and reshaping kind of an entity. It looks differently, right? If you're looking at something when you're sitting straight in front of it, once you drive a mile away from it, it looks very, very different. Divorce is no different. And so processes like introspection and retrospection are going to change. Memories shift, perceptions shift, life shifts, right? As we get older, as our children get older, the things that a divorce implies and the decision-making changes too. So these processes of introspection and retrospection are not one-offs. They're things that one would have to revisit over and over again, particularly, like I said, if you have children, because that impact of the divorce and even the logistics for them is also going to shift over time. And also, as a person kind of propels into a new future, for example, things around dating or perhaps even getting married again, that this introspection and retrospection can not only matter regarding the original marriage, but also as one goes forward into another long-term commitment.
What is the difference between retrospection and introspection?
So retrospection is usually sort of looking back, and it could be looking back an hour ago, it could be looking back 10 years ago, where you sort of go back and you kind of think through what happened, what did you learn from it, how did you feel about it, you piece it together. And retrospection's tricky because retrospection is entirely based on our memory. And if you think memory ain't a camera, folks, memory is something that is also shaped and morphed based on other things that keep happening, right? So this is, in essence, retrospection is sort of looking back at a story. And Kyle, we could shape this around anything in life, right? You could look back at something that happened to you 15 years ago. And 15 years ago, what might have seemed like the greatest disaster of your life, 15 years on might seem like the greatest lesson of your life, right? So retrospection means we shift and we change. And where people are in the middle of a divorce storm, they'll say, what is this nightmare that is my life? And then 10 years on, 15 years on, even a year on, we'll say, that actually was not necessarily a bad thing. It was painful. It was difficult. Not sure I want to do that again. But this might have been an important step in the process of who I was becoming. Now, introspection isn't as time-based. Introspection is really sort of touching back in with ourselves. How do I feel? What am I bringing into this situation? How am I interpreting what's happening to me? So it's remember, human beings are just processing mechanisms. I hate to bring us down to brass tacks, but it's why you and I might look at the same shade of blue and see two different things, right? Well, same thing is experientially, that we are these processing units. And so introspection is how we are processing and how we're sitting with what's happening to us. Two people could have very introspective experiences based on the same situation. Nowhere is that more pronounced than in divorce. So I think introspection should pretty much be a daily part of our lives. But when it comes to divorce, where it's so easy to fall into, this is someone else's fault, I didn't want this, blah, blah, blah. Let's face it. I mean, at some level, yes, you're both having different experiences, but that's going to also checking in with yourself over time and changing it, sort of allowing that to change based on what's happening in life. That is a really crucial part, especially when you're coping with a massive phase shifting transition like a divorce.
What do you want this person going through this course to keep in mind and to know as they go through each step?
As a person goes through this course, I think one thing is that even though all of you are listening to the same course, here's where introspection comes into play, is that it is affecting all of you differently. Some of you who are watching this may be going through divorce experiences that are highly contentious, very, very psychologically harmful. You feel confused, you feel manipulated, you feel harmed, you feel unsupported. And hopefully from this, you're going to learn that this is a difficult journey and have some tools that you can use to turn to when things become particularly difficult, and as well as just some tactics, homework, you name it. For those of you who are going through this and say, well, this isn't easy, but this is something I wanted, even still, any major life transition, even if it's something that you're not necessarily fighting against, still requires tools to help us cope. But above all else, what I want everyone who's watching this, whether you're going through a conflictual divorce or one that seems straightforward, is that there are certain universal reactions to going through divorce. It is a loss. It is a transition. It is a shift in narrative. And as you watch this, you will recognize that you're not the only person who is grappling with some of these issues, who's questioning a lot of the topics we're going to bring up, but that you can take this, again, like anytime you're being taught about something, you can take this and you can personalize it to your own situation. There's nothing in this course that is not universally applicable to people who are going through a massive transition like a divorce, but the key is to make this course useful. You have to personalize it to your unique circumstance and situation.
Yes, and the best way and first way you can start to do that is by completing the self-evaluation. Now, you're going to do this at the end of the course, so I would like for you to do it now so you can see what kind of improvements or work you've made during this course. That self-evaluation is available in the corresponding workbook to this course. In our very first official Step 1, Lesson 1, we're going to talk more about retrospection with Dr. Ramani.
I remember laying on my bedroom floor in the fetal position, obsessively calling my husband. Why wouldn't he pick up? What was he doing? Even though I knew. Eventually, he shut his phone off, and I knew in that moment our marriage was over. I knew he was having an affair, and this time I knew he was leaving me and the children for her. I couldn't grasp that microsecond of my life. The shock and the grief were so consuming. I could do nothing but cower down and cry. I was so confused, hurt, angry, and resentful simultaneously. I didn't even know you could experience so many emotions at the same time, or seemingly so. I could barely pick myself up off of that floor as I laid there wondering, how could somebody who was supposed to be my best friend hurt me so deeply? How could somebody who shared years and children together betray me and abandon and leave us, our whole family, everything we talked about, everything we planned, everything we built? Why?
Welcome to Step 1. The shock of divorce can feel like the rug has been pulled out from under us. We may not know where to turn, even if we knew this loss might have been coming for a while, or we are the ones that made the decision to end our marriage. Taking a step back to reflect on what has happened and how you are doing in this very moment is the most important step in your healing journey. In this step, we take the time to work through some of the most confusing, painful, or disheartening moments so that we can identify where the healing needs to occur and how. Dr. Ramani will walk us through this process and provide us with activities to help us gain clarity and insight to what will help us the most as we move forward. I'll see you in the first lesson.
And as you look back, there's a lot of information there, not just on what practically works, but in terms of how you felt and how you were sort of functioning in the midst of all of this.
Dr. Ramani is here to guide us through some questions for retrospection. Dr. Ramani, take it away.
So when we think about retrospection, there are a couple of things that you can sort of think through to allow you to sort of reflect on this experience. First, to reflect on what is happening, just situationally what's happening. Reflect on how you're feeling, so what you're thinking about it, how you're acting. Also, when you look back on your situation and even something that you're struggling with within your divorce experience right now, what have you tried? Look back. What has worked? Therapy, talking to friends, support groups. And as you think about what worked, look back and reflect on what didn't work. Also, to really reflect on where are you in the process of this divorce? Because divorce isn't just something that's done. You may also be in a place of contemplating, even pursuing a divorce. Or have you filed for divorce? Or have you been served with papers? Or are you done? But as you use these retrospective processes, as you're going to realize is that as you look back on this process of divorce, and again, retrospective doesn't mean months or years ago. It could be as recently as an hour ago. Is to look back and in a way you're sort of getting the data from your own situation. The information is all there, but it can often mean going back and not just looking at the facts, I liked this therapy or this support group was useful, but also looking and frankly feeling back at what these experiences were like. Like, I actually would feel more optimistic after my divorce, after I spoke to my therapist, to file all of this away. Because these retrospective sorts of glances back can help you, especially if you're in the beginning of one of these processes, to see, okay, these are the things that are working for me as I'm going through this difficult time. I'm contemplating this. I'm on the verge of filing for divorce. And as you look back, there's a lot of information there, not just on what practically works, but in terms of how you felt and how you were sort of functioning in the midst of all of this. So using retrospection is a way for you to not only be your own historian, but to learn from your history. So many people get so lost in the logistics of divorce that they forget to feel it. And the feeling becomes one of the key elements to healing. Introspection is a key step to all of that.
Now that you've covered retrospection, let's take a look at introspection with Dr. Ramani.
Where retrospection might be looking back at what this process has been about, the process of going through or even considering divorce, introspection is what it sounds like. It's looking inward. And you can really start with the very basic question of, how are you feeling? Paying attention to the many, many feelings that you're going through. I mean, understanding that probably grief, worry, uncertainty are probably some of the most compelling feelings, but what are all of the other feelings? Because it's not unusual for even relief to be part of that. Pay attention to those feelings. Also pay attention in this moment in time, what's most difficult for you, as well as asking yourself, are you ruminating? And if you are ruminating, what are the topics that feel the most difficult to get unstuck from? What are the thoughts that are the most difficult to let go of, and to make note of that for yourself? It can also be helpful to reflect on not only what your prior knowledge or your prior experiences with divorce, but also with breakups and how that's felt for you in the past. You may want to explore questions with yourself. So for example, do you come from a family where your parents were divorced? And that's part of your history. Reflect on your personal narrative about families that have gone through divorce. We often, many times, carry a divorce story in us, even if we didn't grow up with parents who got a divorce, and that can really impact the decisions and our subjective experience of going through our own divorces. And can really lead you to then to really reflect and introspect on what were your assumptions and what are your assumptions about divorce or even being single again. This kind of introspection is so important in understanding the sorts of decisions that you make about this. Reflect on what you think divorce means about you, what it tells about you, and what does it also mean for your future. As you continue to introspect about divorce, you can also think about, okay, this is how I feel about it, but maybe allow yourself the opportunity for an alternative point of view. Are there other ways you could think or even feel about this? And as you think about these transitions, to really ask yourself, if I do want to make changes in how I'm experiencing this, where do you want to start? What's the first change you want to make? However, don't feel pressure. That one of the issues with introspection is that you allow yourself to feel. We don't want to start trading off to new feelings until you fully experience the ones you're having, because it may very well be that the way you're feeling is your reality. It's the only reality you've got. And feeling sort of pressured to sort of start doing a cognitive twist to sort of turn and force yourself to view this differently, it may be premature for that. So taking the time in introspection to really be present with your feelings about this, with your feelings about divorce, with your feelings about this relationship, and what this means for you in your future, to really stop and think about what does it mean to my identity if I am to now go into a phase of life where divorce is part of my history, and frankly, part of my future. But introspection is taking questions like these and any others you can think of and sitting with them in this moment to really think and reflect and hold on to not just what you think, but also how you feel. When you remain embedded in these sort of introspective moments, it can help ground you in time, allow you to not dissociate too much or disconnect from your feelings, so you can account for all of this as you go through this process, particularly strong feelings like grief and guilt and shame. And by doing this, it can also ensure that you don't get as overwhelmed or exhausted by this process. So many people get so lost in the logistics of divorce that they forget to feel it. And the feeling becomes one of the key elements to healing. Introspection is a key step to all of that.
One thing that I love that Dr. Ramani just said was the question, is there another way I can feel about this? And I think that when we approach that question, not from judgment, not from, hey, me, look at another way to feel about this, but from a place of curiosity, it can be really profound and really exciting to discover other areas of feeling that you may not be aware of. So as you complete this lesson and you go through the journal reflection prompts, whether you do 1 or 15 of them, really come from that place of curiosity. This should be a judgment-free zone, although it can be hard to do that, of course. But I hope that you can reflect compassionately with yourself and get some more insight on this process. In our next lesson, we are going to be talking about envisioning your new future more with Dr. Ramani.
When we're going through divorce, we often move the way that fear makes us move, right? Which is tentative and holding back and very, very focused on what's right in front of us. And switching from fear to explore with curiosity and pull away from fear, keeping it private and doing your utmost to lift that self-judgment. Journaling can be that one place where you can sort of let your thoughts run free in a completely non-judgmental space and to hold space for yourself compassionately. And a great place to start with journaling is to ask yourself the fundamental question, where are you now? And to really dig into that. Where are you emotionally, physically, mentally, spiritually? And lay that out. Some people even draw out their journaling, and that's fine. But then reflect, where would I like to be a year from now? Or 3 years from now? Or even pin that to your children's ages, when my children are 18 and might be living on their own. As you think about that sort of future orientation, you might catch yourself and ask yourself, is this too difficult to think about right now? And if it is, it's okay to say, I'm going to come back to that. I can only think about the hour in front of me. And that in and of itself is an important piece of information. As you write down your feelings, and you're noticing feelings like sadness, anxiety, feeling overwhelmed, frustration, or anger, what other feelings do you think you're supposed to be feeling? Because you feel what you feel, right? There's no supposed to. But negative emotions can be quite overwhelming. And for you in your journaling to think about what might help you manage these negative mood states. Things to also reflect on as you journal are sort of, what does daily life look like now? And if you feel up to it, to think about, where would you like it to get to? Journaling is also a place to lay out for yourself what you think your biggest struggles are. But you can also take a different tack in your journaling and ask yourself, has this transition brought out changes in my life that I actually like? It can often be hard to think about that. Journaling can also be a place where you can reflect on things like barriers and obstacles or anything that might be stopping you from living your daily life in a way that feels most healthy and most authentic. Lay that out as you journal. And as you think about removing those barriers or sort of making those switches, what do you think your daily life would look like as things maybe sort of settle? Again, divorce is a transition. And what do you hope settling down looks like? And as you continue this process of reflection, what would help you get those daily practices into place to create some of those shifts for yourself? So much of what we go through in a divorce is so much logistical stuff. It's legal documents and it's parenting agreements and it's sign on the dotted line and it's financial agreements that we forget that there's also a lot of feeling that needs to be managed. We also forget that really it's daily life that often takes up the most of our attention. And so while the big ticket stuff may always be looming there are still the routines in your life for you to think about, how is this going to look differently now that I am leaving this relationship, now that I'm getting a divorce? And where do you want this to go for you? However you envision this, journaling becomes a place to sort of let these kinds of thoughts and feelings run free. It can actually be quite helpful. You'll find that if you do write this down and put it away and pull it out years from now, you're going to see how far you came. And down the road, that's its own sort of legacy and inheritance you've given yourself, because you'll say, wow, I really did a lot of this. When we're going through divorce, we often move the way that fear makes us move, right? Which is tentative and holding back and very, very focused on what's right in front of us. Allow yourself to widen that lens and see a little further down the track. May not be a year or 3 years down the track, but what do you want your life to look like next week, next month, at the end of the year? You might be able to use more manageable kinds of windows of time. And switching from fear to curiosity is really a huge transition, and healing through the process of divorce and using journaling as a place to do that, to explore with curiosity and pull away from fear, keeping it private and doing your utmost to lift that self-judgment, to approach journaling from a place of self-forgiveness and self-compassion, can be one place that you have that sort of becomes your kind of field to explore that nobody else needs to know about. Put that stuff down, because sometimes you might find it may not feel helpful now, but in a year or two, it may be a very reassuring companion.
You're doing great. We've made it all the way through step 2, 4 more steps to go. As a reminder, make sure you engage in the daily activities in the MedCircle Community Hub and also in the divorce community. In our next step, we will get into the cognitive, emotional, and behavioral processing of the events and strategies to help you carry through. Remember, whatever it is you're going through, you got this, and we'll see you in the next step. In this digital journal activity, we're going to think, pair, and share. You'll reflect and think about what you understand better and what you're still confused about when it comes to navigating this divorce. I encourage you to get with another member in the community, and this can also just be a friend or family member as well, but somebody that you trust, to discuss these questions and answers together. Then report back to the community for a joint discussion and identify parallels and differences between experiences among different members in the community.
Having those relationships, cultivating those relationships, those places where you can be yourself, where you can feel supported, where you're reminded that a life after divorce isn't a life being spent alone on an ice floe, but rather it's a life where you're going to be surrounded by your social support network. And it may be a very different way to view relating in the world, where you might have been used to going out as a dyad, but being part of a group. We know that to be very, very healthy.
Welcome to step number 2, understanding this process more fully. Here to dive in is, of course, clinical psychologist Dr. Ramani. Now, Dr. Ramani, I know you're not a lawyer, but I would like to get your perspective and experience, especially with all the clients that you've worked with through divorce. What can people expect through a, quote, typical divorce, or is there even such thing as a typical divorce?
Yeah, Kyle, I think that's the key, is that there is no typical divorce. And so there's a range of decisions that obviously people will have to undertake upon sort of consultation, ranging from whether or not people are going to retain an attorney, if they're going to try to use mediation, how one interacts with the family court system. In some cases, it's not that much. If it's very, very straightforward, some people find that they don't need as much guidance, but in many cases, people find that they need tremendous amounts of guidance, and there are other professionals brought in, especially if there are issues around coming to an amenable custody agreement and, the needs of children in these situations. So you're going to see everything from people almost DIYing this stuff all the way up to years and years of legal proceedings and people who are going in and out of the court and taking, a long time to get a parenting agreement set. It's also going to vary in terms of finances. In some cases, both people are bringing in their own money, but how they're going to meet out finances or joint accounts that need to be managed. There's a lot of moving parts. And so, again, my background is very much in working with people who are in more toxic, antagonistic, narcissistic spaces. In those cases, I always say almost unilaterally, people have to consult with an attorney because there's a lot more complication in those divorces. In some cases, it's a relatively, if you want to call it, an amicable divorce, and people are able to do this through mediation. There's a lot of agreement on how things are going to be divided. Keep in mind too, Kyle, divorce laws vary in all of the different states in the United States. There are different kinds of rules and stipulation, and in different countries around the world. So anybody who's watching this has to be very, very clear that what is even true in even your state, even if you live 10 miles from the border of the next state, the rules may be very different there in terms of community property, in terms of laws around custody, in terms of finances in a divorce, all of that. So it becomes very, very important for each person to do their due diligence. And I always tell people, don't assume just because the other person, your soon-to-be ex-spouse, has their own counsel and they're telling you, we've got it all figured out. Always get your questions answered, even if it means you're paying an attorney for an hour of time just to get yourself oriented to the process. Always make sure that you have someone who is acting on your behest and giving you information that you need. If anything's unclear to you or things that feel that they're sort of opaque or shaded, you make sure you get the guidance you need. And for people who are struggling financially, this gets a lot harder. One thing that I will suggest to folks is that, for example, sometimes domestic violence programs will have legal counsel available as part of their programs. That's going to vary state to state, city to city, county to county. But I do suggest to people that you can go and look into those resources because there are sometimes low-cost legal resources available. If you get your mental health care in a clinic setting, there may also be someone there who can connect you to those kinds of legal resources. But people should not be being made to sign papers that have massive ramifications without feeling as though they have been guided through this process and are fully aware of what it is that they're agreeing to.
Really great input. What about for people getting a divorce who are also preparing to co-parent?
Yeah.
What should they be expecting?
That's a whole nother level. And again, it's on that same continuum. In some cases, and this I think I have to say that even if the two adults in the divorce now, marriage, but now divorce, believe that, okay, that we're done, And there can be, if you will, a quote unquote amicability there. When it comes to parenting, sometimes differences on parenting are exactly why these people are getting divorced. Co-parenting is where almost invariably the divorce waters get a heck of a lot more muddy. Now, as I said, there's a continuum from people who are in tremendous agreement about how to proceed. In fact, some families who I really tip my hat to engage in what are called nesting arrangements, where the kids always stay in the same house and the parents keep swapping out of that house. And I think that's an amazing strategy if people could do that, because it really it delimits the disruption to the children in those kinds of situations, but again, not everyone has a setup where they can do that. It is about having very, very clear and realistic expectations. And you also have to be aware of all these details you may not have always thought about. For example, consent for things like mental health care, and how many people need to sign off on what, and how you're going to meet out the holidays. And, there's so many little details we often don't think about in our children's lives, that when all of a sudden they're showing up in this way, that you have to sort of figure out how many days at Christmas and how many days at this holiday and how many days at summer and so on and so forth. It can become quite Byzantine, and getting guidance and support through this process. Therapy becomes a really important adjunct. Talking with an attorney becomes a really important space. And again, if you're both on the same page, some people are able to manage this through mediation, which is great. Some people have just a clean 50-50 cut. But I do think having at least one sounding board, therapist is often that person, but one place you can go to sort of hear what different people do, that can even also be quite useful. That's why this course is so useful, because you might sort of learn about some of those options. But when it comes to co-parenting agreements, this is about the best interests of the children. Should not be about what's convenient for a parent. It really should be what is in the best interest of these children in a situation that's already probably not going to be easy for them. And so you also have to think about school and geography of schools. And there's so many small pieces. And so a lot of folks will get overwhelmed when they think we're getting divorced. And then all of a sudden there's all these sort of granular stuff you have to account for when children are involved. And keep in mind too, Kyle, a lot of this has to do with the age of the children. If you're getting divorced when you have a child who's under 2, that's obviously a very different path forward than children who are toddlers, primary school, puberty, or adolescents. And the final piece to remember is that this is a very sort of moving narrative, in the sense that the kinds of decisions you make for a 5-year-old might look very different for a 15-year-old, and life happens. People get transferred in their jobs. Financial situations shift in life. So this is not a one-time decision. I think what people need to understand is that when they set up their parenting agreement, that this becomes a sort of living, dynamic document that may need to shift with time. The more antagonistic the other person in your divorce, the more difficult it is going to be to come to a healthy parenting agreement, or to even come to a parenting agreement that's honored. But again, in healthier situations, most co-parents are able to sort of navigate this, but you have to be, your situation. So you need to be prepared for that. And if there's any concern that this is shaping up to be a more antagonistic or sort of toxic divorce, make sure that, again, you have an attorney who's providing guidance and is very, very tapped into the rules and stipulations of the state in which you live.
How do I decide what battle I'm going to die on the hill for, and which battles I'm just going to give up on? For example, I love your explanation of the nesting scenario where the child stays in the house. But if my antagonistic, soon-to-be ex-partner isn't going to do that, what do I do?
You don't nest. I mean, let's keep it real, Kyle. And I think this is about keeping it real. I'm not going to sit here and give you gold standard divorce guidance and think that everyone's going to have the opportunity to sort of take advantage of this. So I do think that what hill are you going to die on? A lot of this is dictated by the needs of your children. Some people, for example, may have children who are living with special needs, where routine and order becomes the most important thing. Those parents may be making very different kinds of decisions around a parenting agreement than children who are at different ages and stages. So there are so many variables going into this. But again, it may be an issue around a school. Some parents will say, okay, I'm moving me and 3 kids into a 1-bedroom apartment because it's the only way we can stay in this school.
Even during the early stages of divorce, Dr. Romney, a lot of people are ready to date. What are your thoughts about dating or holding off on dating?
It's such a complicated question, Kyle, because you've got to remember that when a person is going through divorce, this relationship may have been floundering for a long time. So
Yes.
people are, what might feel like, what, you're dating already? This person may have been deeply lonely or been in a deeply unhealthy relationship for years. So I think that number one, you have to be prepared, sadly, that people may judge you harshly, not knowing all the details of your story. The decision around dating is also going to vary depending on whether or not you have children. As a therapist, I'm always going to say, try to slow your roll a little bit if you've got kids, because they're already quite disrupted and destabilized by what has happened. And so if new people are coming into their lives, that's even more confusing. So really taking your time with that. And even if you were to date, perhaps not introducing your child to that new person would be sort of kind of best practices. If you're in a more amicable situation and talking with your ex-partner, ex-spouse about how you're going to proceed with dating, what are you going to have the relationship has to last this much time before someone gets introduced. I'd like to meet that person first. All those sorts of decisions, and again, in a more healthy divorce, there's the possibility for that conversation to happen. In less healthy divorce situations, and certainly toxic antagonistic ones, it's not unusual for the ex-spouse to move into a new relationship right away. But in your situation, there's a psychology to divorce, Kyle, that's really fascinating, that even if a divorce is protracted for years, even if you've been living in separate homes for years, there's the day that final piece of paper comes. And according to the state, you are no longer married. You are 2 individual citizens living out in the world. Something visceral and psychological happens that day, even though practically your lives have been different. And I'm not going to sit here and say to everyone, you got to wait until the ink dries, because the ink can take a long time to dry or even get on the paper. However, that understand that each of these junctures in the process can have different meaning. And for some people, they may not feel comfortable dating until that paper is signed, because as far as they're concerned, frankly, they're still married in the eyes of the court, in the eyes of the law, I suppose. And so I think that these decisions are different for everyone. But I tell people, number one, if you're going to be dating after divorce, especially if you're in that sort of what I call the demilitarized zone before you're officially divorced, be prepared for other people's judgment. Number 2, always account for your children, always. And in an ideal world, you and your ex have a plan in terms of how long you're going to wait before a child gets introduced, and sort of how you're going to manage those situations. And I think it's also to be prepared, to the degree you could be prepared for things that are a little bit sort of destabilizing, is that this may not be as easy as you think. Because a marriage and all the things that go along with it, a shared home and a shared history, and especially if you were in a very long-term marriage, that transition to someone new can be quite overwhelming and in some ways almost unsettling. And so if you've been out of the dating game for a while, you're coming out of a 20 or 30-year marriage, we know Dr. Romney's rules on dating. I'll always say, if you've come out of a significantly long relationship, especially if there's any significant sort of conflict or antagonism, take at least a year off. Spend a year getting acquainted back with you, getting to know you, doing things on your rhythms. That time alone is so healing. And many people who at once were dubious, after they're a year out, they're like, oh, I'm going to do this for a while. But they recognize that there was such a pull, and be prepared for pressure. Interestingly, as much as people may shame you for starting to date, you're going to have an entire other cadre of people are saying, you can date again? Get out there. I mean, I think they're sort of channeling their single dreams through you, right? Because they're tired of the person they're sleeping next to, but they don't quite want to get divorced, right? But ultimately, this is to be done on your schedule. And some people will say sort of the shock that a divorce was in their life It took them a long time to feel safe with someone again, to be physical or intimate with someone again. But I think that everyone needs to understand this is going to be different depending on who you are, but give it time. As much time as you think it's going to take, you might want to double that. And while you might feel like a kid in a candy store and like, I don't need to be lonely anymore and I can start having sex again and I can start meeting people again, meet you again. Like sort of feel your unmarried self in the world and what that feels like and get acquainted with it. For years, you have done the workarounds on snoring and holidays and what you eat on Thursday nights. Get into those new rhythms for yourself first, and then sort of meander into that dating space and recognize that dating may have changed a lot since the last time you were out there. So just sort of be prepared. I would often recommend doing more social things in groups and having that world of socializing with friends and being out in the world in that way without someone sort of that's at your side. That's enough of a transition. Start there and then go from there.
Maybe 2 or 3 years ago, Dr. Ramani, I spent a whole month interviewing only people with lived experience in mental health, people who had gone through big challenges and obstacles in their life. And all of them said the number one thing that got them through it, that helped them through it, they loved education, they loved therapy, all of that was great. But the number one thing was their support system.
Absolutely.
During this time where we have people saying, you need to date. No, you not need to date. You should do this. You should do that. How do we find our support system that's going to be healthy for us?
It's actually a more complicated question than you might think in the case of divorce, because many people may find that when they were married, their spouse was sort of their person, or they may have been limited from spending time with friends and family the way they wanted because of maybe some controlling features of their spouse. So you may very well, I don't want to say burned bridges, but there may be relationships that you may not have been tending to for a very long time. And there might even be a period that feels almost like making amends. Like basically, I'm sorry I disappeared for 5 years. And, to which I say humility is such an important part of that kind of amends making and saying, I disappeared for a long time and that wasn't okay, especially if your friend went or your family member went through stuff in that period of time. And be prepared that you are now having to enter maybe social worlds that you haven't taken as sort of have cultivated in the way that you would when you weren't married. So that's one piece. But social support is everything. We know that, like you said, across mental health. We know that in terms of survivorship from trauma. And we definitely know it when it comes through major life transitions, including grief and divorce and situations like that. Having those relationships, cultivating those relationships, those places where you can be yourself, where you can feel supported, where you're reminded that a life after divorce isn't a life being spent alone on an ice floe, but rather it's a life where you're going to be surrounded by your social support network. And it may be a very different way to view relating in the world, where you might have been used to going out as a dyad, but being part of a group. We know that to be very, very healthy. And here's where it gets interesting. Women are often better than this than men. Women are much better at taking care of their social networks and in a very specific way. And again, I'm using the binary here. Again, our research is slowly coming up on people with a range of gender identity. But when we look at women, they traditionally have taken care of, because they're caregivers, right? So they may be more plugged into a family system. They may have made friends with the parents of their children's friends. So they may have that more built in. Men may find themselves stumbling a bit where their spouse might have been their constant go-to, and men may experience more loneliness in that post-divorce phase. Social support is so important. And support groups, don't underestimate them. So divorce support groups, other people going through exactly what you're going through, can also be a useful space so you don't feel so alone.
Oftentimes, dear viewer, getting all of this information and insight and answers actually prompt more questions. As we wrap up this first lesson, I would like you to write down what questions you still have about the divorce process. Then list any resources that can get you those answers. As new questions come up, make sure you add those to your list. In addition to your support community, you are likely to find another community right here on MedCircle for people who are not only going through divorce, but also going through this course. It's a great way to connect with people and share those experiences. You're not alone in this. And again, we are stronger together. In our next lesson, we'll talk more about the grief process with Dr. Ramani.
This process of grief has been going on for this long time, and it almost plays out in different ways as new losses mount up. First, there's a loss of, wow, this relationship isn't working. Then there's the loss of, we are going to split up. Then the loss of losing potentially your home or another person you're used to having in your home. And then there's a loss of time with your children. Each time you do this, you're almost re-experiencing that grief cycle again. And so people feel very exhausted by this process, and you can understand how in some cases this can culminate in full-blown depression for folks.
Dr. Ramani, if we assume that we don't want to be in this relationship any longer, why is it hard for us to detach from that old life and that old relationship when we don't want to be there in the first place?
I mean, Kyle, I think we forget how complicated a relationship is, especially when it's a marriage, right? There's obviously the other person and how we feel about them, but there's lots of other stuff that's happening too, right? There's a home you have with someone, there's a future you have, there's a collection of friends, there's extended family, and obviously, most importantly, there's the children you have together. And then throw in there some pets and all of that many people will say, I like a lot of our life. I don't know that I like this person. And that gets challenging because there's a lot of grief at leaving that. And then we get to a deeper part of this, which is identity. That a person has identity as a married person, as a person who's at the helm of a family system, and sort of the beehive of activity that happens around a family. So these issues around identity, around belonging, around being a part of something bigger that isn't just the relationship, but all that's around it, again, particularly your children, means that the loss of divorce, like I hate to say it, it's often not the relationship, though there's partly that, but it's often all the other stuff. And most compellingly, it's often the narrative. You know, that there was a time in my life I thought I was going to grow old with this person. I'm going to spend the rest of my life with this person. We had a public sort of the world saw us as obviously separate people, but also in something together. All of that's getting dismantled. That's a lot of loss, even if you don't like this person anymore. And some people, you got to remember, divorce is tricky because there's sort of three ways the story could be told. You want it and the other person doesn't. The other person wants it and you don't. Or it's a conclusion you came to together. That middle path ain't the biggest path here, right? It's usually one person in this divorce feels like something's happening to them that they don't want. So if the more you're in that second chair that this is happening to you and you don't want it to happen, it's a tremendous amount of loss. Even if a person feels like, yeah, no, I'm not. I don't absolutely like everything about this person, but wasn't ready to walk away from it, that again brings up tremendous grief.
Are you saying that the more common scenario is that one person wants the divorce and not the other?
I think so. Yeah.
That's what you think?
Yeah. Because when you think about it, because there's two ways that could be. Person A, spouse A or spouse B doesn't want it. Yeah. So it's, that amenable, that situation. Listen, I mean, a marriage sometimes can really benefit one person a lot and not so much the other. We start getting into that a lot when there's a lot of inequity in the roles in a relationship. So one person's really having to carry the weight of the caregiving burdens and all the rest of it, that there can be a lack of satisfaction for whatever reason. One person may also resent having to do a lot of the wage earning and not getting to spend time with children. It's not one or the other. But when there's more and more and more and more and more of that imbalance, we see greater dissatisfaction. And that may be felt in a more compounded way by one person in a relationship.
Interesting. We're going to talk about the grief process here in a little bit, but what is disenfranchised grief and ambiguous grief?
So disenfranchised grief is the grief that doesn't get recognized as grief in the world, right? So a great example of this, and it's a little different than divorce, would be a person loses a pet. We often trivialize when a person's dog or cat or pet has died, and yet the profundity of the loss of a pet actually can be felt as a greater grief than the loss of a human being in someone's life, given how close they might be to that pet. And yet, we would never give a person that kind of grace in terms of time off from work. We would look at them sideways if they were grieving for more than a week or two. And how that's a great example of disenfranchised grief. Right? We also get into the place of, for example, other losses that might happen. Someone's very much alive, but now they have an illness that they can't show up as maybe a caregiver or even a partner. That we get into a situation where a person maybe going through an illness or something else in their life, so they won't be able to show up as a caregiver or a partner in the same way. Examples of this might be dementia or other sorts of physical health issues that could come up. And so there can be this sense of the other person in the relationship may feel the sense of grief because their partner's not present in the same way or something else is going on. And yet others will say, well, they're still alive. Why would you be feeling grief? We often reserve the term grief for the loss secondary to death. So these sorts of other losses, often the person going through that kind of grief doesn't get the sort of societal space, if you will, to grieve that sort of a loss.
Yeah. Was that both disenfranchised and ambiguous?
I think when we get into the concept of sort of ambiguous grief, it shares a lot of top notes with the idea of disenfranchised grief. I see this a lot in the world of folks who are going through narcissistic relationships. It's a great example of where we see the ambiguous loss, where a person is in a relationship, they're still in a relationship, but they're feeling this tremendous grief because they have this recognition of, oh my gosh, my partner's never going to change. Like this mess that this relationship is always going to be like that. So it is this, again, it's partly disenfranchised in the sense of it's not recognized in the world that way, but a person isn't just immediately leaving that relationship. So it gets into this really murky space of exactly what is it you're losing? You're still married. This person isn't going anywhere. So what's the loss? And so people who are going through that, when they use the term grief, and I have to tell you, Kyle, when I've talked with folks who are on the verge of divorce or going through divorce, and I use the word grief, there's a light bulb that goes on for the person who says, that's it, I'm going through grief. But I can't really pin down what the loss is. And the loss is all that stuff, the loss of belonging, the loss of being a part of something. Maybe sometimes it's the loss of sort of financial security. It's the loss of a narrative. It's the loss of, am I going to grow old alone? It's the loss of my kids don't get to have their same bedrooms they always had. So there's all these losses that don't get piled into that space of grief, and which we traditionally have held as a term referred to the experience someone has after they experience a loss through death.
I'm reminded of common losses for people going through a divorce, including I'm losing these friends that I used to have from my spouse, or the great in-laws that I had, and that I may not have those relationships anymore. How do we kind of come to terms with losing those people who we have no problems with, but we're not in the relationship anymore?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up, Kyle, because the loss of these other people in a social network is enormous, right? And the people around you often feel like they're in the uncomfortable position of having to, if you will, choose. It's really hard to skirt a 50-50 line, right? Because now, let's say, for example, one person didn't want it as much, the other one did, and one of them moves on more quickly with a new partner. And if you're trying to be friends with both of them, now you've met the new partner and you feel like you're betraying them. So that does mean that, I'm sorry, in every divorce I've ever seen, not that people choose sides, but they definitely flop over into one side more than the other, right? And as you spoke about, the loss of these other people who could be very significant in your life, like in-laws, especially if those in-laws were deeply involved in your children's lives, people who are regular fixtures in your life that are no longer present in the same way. And if any of those people think you're the reason this fell apart, people you once thought were loving people in your life may show a very different face to you because they may not also have the entire story. So I think that the grief of these other, I'm going to call them collateral losses, that you didn't even account for and what that feels like. People that you felt familiar with, people that you saw every Thanksgiving, that all of that has been dismantled. When you're often in the weeds in a divorce, you don't stop to think about those circumstances right away. But the first time they really present themselves to you, it can be really, really unsettling. And you're struck with, I didn't just lose one person. I lost dozens and dozens of people. And again, we don't have terms for that kind of grief.
The grief cycle, almost everyone has heard of it. And I think most people know now, Dr. Romney, that it doesn't have to go in a certain step. But can you explain what the cycle of grief is and what people could be expecting or experiencing during this time?
So traditionally, we've used sort of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's model of grief, going through these stages of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. When you look at David Kessler's work, who worked with Kubler-Ross, he added that final stage of meaning and purpose. So this entire kind of arc of grief, everyone wants it to go through the stages, right? Like, I'm in denial. No, I'm mad. It doesn't work that way. Some people go right to depression.
Can't wait till I'm depressed.
Right. Some people go right to depression. Some people pop into bargaining. And bargaining is things like, if only I had tried this. If only I had done this. If only I had been the one to drive them to the hospital. If only we'd gone to the better hospital. Those are the kinds of things we might also see filed under sort of bargaining, right? And that can be a torturous phase. In a divorce, you could imagine like, well, maybe I didn't do this right. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. And I shouldn't have chosen this person. And why did I do this to my kids? So that bargaining phase actually would take on a different kind of a tenor for folks who are going through a divorce situation, because it's not as though someone's passed and now that loss is a permanent loss. It's more of a, this person is still very much alive in the world and still very much could be a presence, not only in your life, but certainly in your children's lives. So you have to be prepared. Yes, you will go through it. And I think that people though, Kyle, who are going through the grief of divorce, this doesn't just happen magically the day they both move to separate homes, or that the day that they file paperwork, or the day they sign paperwork. This grief started a long time ago when eyes got open to this relationship is really not going very well. This relationship is not healthy. And so already at that time, there could have been a lot of denial. No, it's not that bad, right? And then the anger. And so a lot of this stuff is built in to a sort of a toxic relational cycle, if you will. So this process of grief has been going on for this long time, and it almost plays out in different ways as new losses mount up. First, there's a loss of, wow, this relationship isn't working. Then there's, or someone's just told me they don't feel like they're not in love with me anymore. Then there's the loss of, we are going to split up. Then the loss of losing potentially your home or another person you're used to having in your home. And then there's a loss of time with your children. If it's about children, the loss of friends. Each time you do this, you're almost re-experiencing that grief cycle again, because it's new losses, new. This is like having multiple people around you pass away over and over and over and over again, because you're having to replay this cycle because the losses sort of keep mounting up. And so people feel very exhausted by this process, and you can understand how in some cases this can culminate in full-blown depression for folks, because that kind of constancy of grief is really, really demanding. And I think for anyone watching this, stay with that term grief, because if you have ever had someone you've lost in your life to death, and you see how similar some of these sort of processes are, and you're thinking, I'm being ridiculous, no one's dead. Things died here. And, it's hard to think of it that way, but these are oftentimes permanent losses, and permanent losses are processed in a way that, again, grief, death, and birth are probably the only three universal experiences we have as human beings. And so every human being is going to go through grief at some point if you've cared about even one person on this planet. And so that's the thing to keep in mind, is that it's so universal in this, but it's repeated over and over again. Now, obviously, the money here is on the acceptance to get to, this is it, this is how it is. And it's not even necessarily radical acceptance, but this is my new life. And when we look at Kessler's work on meaning and purpose, is that instead of viewing the marriage as all sort of a wasted experience, or what the hell was I doing, or I wasted 20 years of my life, it's more of, from this marriage came children that I love. From this marriage, I learned things about myself. I mean, it's harder to do, and everyone gets to that in a very different way. But when the whole narrative becomes more coherent about the whole marriage, people are then able to sort of cope, heal, and move forward in a very, very different way. So that meaning and purpose part of the grief process really can't be underestimated, particularly in the case of divorce, where the reminder of the divorce, especially if you have children, is sort of constantly there for you.
Let's focus on that person who did not want this divorce, but here they are. They're experiencing major, major heartbreak. And I would imagine, Dr. Ramani, if I had to choose, not that if I had to choose, but if I was on one side, if I was on the side that didn't want the divorce, to me, I feel like that would be harder than the person who goes, oh my gosh, I want to get out of this, give me my divorce. What do you think?
It's a very interesting question, Kyle, and I don't think there's an easy answer to it because I think it might very much be based on the temperament of the person going through it. I have a very different reaction to you. For me, and I'm going to put this personally, not that anyone cares, but like for me, the seventh circle of hell is hurting another person. I hate it so much so that if someone broke up with me, I'd rather be left to myself so I can go cry in a corner for a while than to be the one who felt responsible for someone else's broken heart. So I'd rather be left any day. I know not everyone feels that way. Abandonment is not my core wound. So I think but hurting other people is. Guilt's mine. So it's a very different experience. And you're saying, I'd rather be the one who's saying it's done. People who are, when someone else approaches them and asks for a divorce, especially if they thought they were in a healthy, functional marriage, it is the ultimate having the rug pulled out from under you, right? And I think that I don't even think it's an either or there. I think it has to do with things like I'm saying, core wounds, a person's history, how a person copes with loss traditionally. So I think that those seats, I agree with you, Kyle. I think the vast majority of people would rather be the one to do the breaking up than to be the one that is sort of surprised by what happens in a relational ending of any kind, and most certainly in a divorce. I think that in divorce, there's something unique, though. If you're the person who's not prepared, divorce, unlike many other breakups, there's a lot of tactical preparation that has to happen. Financial preparation and future preparation. And the person who's asking for the divorce has actually had the time to do some of that. Now you're having to catch up in a race, right? Of like, what does this mean for me? Where am I going to go? Da, da, da. You know what I'm saying? Like there's a laundry list of things because you often have a very intermingled life, financially, practically, family, children, all of that, that the idea that this is happening to you, especially if it's something that takes you by surprise, can be a lot more difficult. In many cases, it's not a surprise. It's a couple that's maybe going to therapy and trying to work on it and trying to communicate. And still one of them gets to that finish line of, I can't do this anymore. And the other person still feels like there's some fight there. And keep in mind too, Kyle, some people are firmly committed and entrenched in the idea, I'm never going to get divorced. It feels like a failure to them. It feels culturally prohibited to them. They often view that their parents' divorce was a cataclysm in their own childhood, so they don't want to do it. So it may not even, they're like, I don't like this person, but I don't want to be divorced. So it becomes its own kind of shift in identity. So there's a lot of pieces to this. I agree with you. I think most people would rather be the one who's saying, I'm done and I want out. People like me might say, well, I'd rather it was done to me. So that speaks to the differences in psychology that there are out there in individual people.
Well, I've never been divorced, but I've not been married. But I lost a great friend in my 20s, and it felt like grieving because we were best friends, and this person decided not to be friends with me anymore because I'm gay, and that did not align with her religious beliefs. All of the sudden, okay. And then we reconnected years and years later, and I was really nervous about this meeting. And in the meeting, in this lunch, she apologized for cutting me off for those reasons. And then she told me how upset and sad she was for the loss of the friendship. And I had never considered that she was upset about it. I thought she was happy about it. And I thought, how could you be happy about losing me as a friend? We've been friends for so long. And when she told me she was upset about the loss of our friendship, I felt good. I felt peaceful. I was like, okay, it wasn't just me suffering. We both lost this together. Do you think there is truth in people getting a divorce that even if some person asked it, the person who didn't ask for the divorce could still find solace in the fact that they're both mourning?
Yes,
Or is
if they're
that like
if yes, I mean,
proof?
I don't care. I mean, other than like a full blown case of psychopathy or sociopathy or some very severe narcissism, people are sad when marriages end, because Kyle, there was a moment in time where people dressed up, and you stood in front of people, and you proclaimed your forever commitment and love to this person. There was a moment in time where this was absolutely real. And there is a loss associated with that, right? Even if it's the most ugly of situations and you've been replaced by a new partner and all of that, there is a loss. And I agree with you. What you're saying, I felt good. I think you felt seen. And I think feeling seen sometimes is even more important than feeling loved, right? Because it's this sense of someone is sharing this experience. We're both going through this, and yes, we might be having different experiences. One of us wants out quicker than the other, but that sense that this wasn't easy for the other person, that there was a sense of genuine loss for them, can help us feel as though, okay, we feel less disposable. We feel less unwanted. We feel, it feels as though we were real to this person and then life happened. But when it feels as though that's not the case and that we were simply discarded, that can really magnify this experience of loss and grief and pain. Every divorce story is different. In fact, I would say there's a lot more nuance to a divorce story than there often is to a love story.
Ooh. Well said, Dr. Ramani. Well said. I hope we capture that as a soundbite somewhere. I mean, that is it, y'all. There's more nuance to the divorce story than there is to the love story. So, so true. How do we help these kids grieve?
How do we help children grieve?
Yes.
We help children grieve by allowing them to have their feelings, right? Grief is one of those processes that is universal. Like I said, it's universal for all human beings, and different cultures are better about it than others. Think about the grief after someone dies. There's a funeral. There are processes. We wear different colored clothes. In some cultures, you lock away from the world for a while. You cover mirrors, whatever your cultural traditions are, right? And so there's a process that's a shared process of everyone who's going through that death and that loss. And because it's a shared process, and because there's time given to it, we then come out the other side. I'm not saying it makes it go away like that, but there was a moment in time when it was actually formally recognized. We don't do that for divorce. There is no funeral. I suppose there might be a day in the courthouse, there might be a day that papers end up in your mailbox, but that's very, very different. And you may feel as though you're going through it alone, but you're not if you've got kids. And your kids are going through something too. And kids feel this, because remember, your kids have been living in a home where there were two people that were unhappily married for a while. So they're carrying that burden too. I think we always forget. We make it all about how the divorce is harming the kids. I'm like, no, all that unhealthy relational stuff that led up to that moment is also affecting your kids. Your children were deeply aware that they were in a home with two unhappy people. And that is an accumulated toll on children, depending on how long that got dragged out for. And especially if it's made even messier by things like infidelities and other harms within the relationship that are causing harm to the people within that marriage, the children are soaking all of that up. So this isn't about the divorce as much as it's the entire arc of this unhealthy relationship. Wow. But when the marriage ends, something significant also changes for your children, because now their parents are divorced parents, often typically living in two different residences. The social status and the economic status of one of the parents may also significantly change. And they might see a family that was once living in a comfortable home that's now one member of that family, one of the parents, is now living in a far more, if you will, downgraded kind of a living circumstance. So they're taking that in. Children may process this as guilt, as pity. Children may wonder if they were the ones to blame. All very common reactions. And so it is about letting your children feel. Don't immediately go to, well, no, this is going to be great because now me and your other parent are happy. You let them be with the feeling. You allow them to have their grief. And grief, anger is a phase, Don't be surprised if you have a child who might start acting out in school, acting out with peers. You might have a very angry adolescent on your hands. And that's an uncomfortable feeling to be with, but that's their feeling, and hold space for that and have empathy for it, and don't put their healing on a schedule. Ideally, your children have access to mental health services like therapy, where they have a safe place to share how angry they are. Children often don't feel comfortable sharing these feelings of saying, this is mom's fault. If mom hadn't done this, this wouldn't have happened. Well, that's a really uncomfortable conversation to have with either parent, but to have that objective, neutral, confidential space can really go a long way for that child to be able to sort of let go of some of these feelings and be given permission for having those feelings. But I think that there's a mistake parents will sometimes make is, trying to do like, let's have the Disneyland experience, right? Let's go off and let's make it fun. And isn't this exciting? And while certainly you want your child to feel comfortable, you want to create new living spaces for them that reflect them, that have familiar things, all of those sort of strategic things. None of that is ever going to help you evade the grief. The grief is going to be a universal for every child whose parents get divorced. And there's no amount of stuff or experiences or anything you can give them. And this is probably the hardest part of the ride. Any parent most parents would be willing to take on 10,000 tons of grief if their children could experience none. But that's not how this works.
How honest do you recommend we are with our children? Meaning, if I have a 16-year-old, a 17-year-old who says, why did you get divorced? Does dad still love me? Do you still love dad? How honest should we be with those answers?
You have to, number one, you have to respond to a child developmentally where they're at. Okay? Number two, whatever happened between you and this parent, all things being equal, and I'm assuming that this parent hasn't abused the child and all of that. Okay, let's just lift that out. But no matter what this parent might have done to you, you don't get to talk badly about that other parent. Your child will find it on their own. If their other parent is not they will find it. They will figure it out. That's not your place. It is the most confusing thing a child can experience, is if they're hearing these confusing, muddying narratives from their other parent. Do not. You work this out in your own places, your own therapy. Your child doesn't need to hear that. Now, there's these questions of, do you still love me? Obviously, you still love them. The other parent still loves them, we hope. And you want your child to feel safe in this, but you can also use more obtuse language, is the best I can say, is like, listen, relationships don't always work out. You are the blessing that came from this relationship. So I don't regret it for a minute, even though you regret it. You may regret it. That's your story. The child doesn't need to know this. Saying things to your child like, I wish I never married this. I wish I never married them. And blah, blah, blah. The child is a product of that relationship. The child does not want to hear this. They only exist because you got together with that person. They have to, really it's allowing the child know that they are the gift, the benediction of a relationship that didn't work out, that sometimes adult relationships don't work out. You might even say, listen, we met in high school. We were young. And when you're young, you don't always make the best decisions. And it might even be a teaching moment for that 16-year-old to say, just make sure you take the time to live your life as a young adult and as an adult before you make these choices. And, and then you can, things like we were too young, that feels less like this is a bad person, or, people grow apart. Things like this happen. Your child does not need that full frontal narrative. And I will tell you, it is very, very painful for a child to be made to hold that adult bag. It's a boundary violation. It is intrusive. No child should be in that role. And as your child gets older into full-on adulthood over the age of 25 or 30, perhaps even then, you still want to be tentative, because they may still have a relationship with that other parent that they don't want contaminated with some of the foibles and things that come up in a marriage that they necessarily don't need to be privy to. But it's a tough line. And as a child goes into adulthood and they ask you very bluntly, I want to hear the whole thing, and they're open about that, that's a different story. But when they're kids, I mean, you really want to make sure that they feel safe and they don't feel like they're in the role of having to defend the other parent, because no child should be put into that role.
Yeah, well said. Any final words on the grief process as it relates to divorce or helping our child grieve?
Even if you want a divorce, you will grieve. So I think that even people say, oh, I'm so relieved I'm out of this relationship, you will still grieve, because it was
Yeah.
more than just the person. There's so much else that comprises what a marriage is in our culture, right? And so I think that understanding that, a lot of people will say the grief confuses them. They'll say, maybe I didn't do the right thing because I'm sort of having such a strong emotional reaction to this. Maybe this wasn't the right call. Maybe we should have stayed married. Not necessarily, but something has been lost. And part of it, again, we talked about retrospection and introspection earlier in this program, is that something to really stay focused on is this idea of, how did you come to this decision? What was happening? It could very well be that you, for example, had very, very different takes on how to manage money, and that was enough to break the relationship down. But there still might have been things you loved about a person. I'm thinking about a case offhand that there's a person said that their spouse was the most financially irresponsible, overgrown adolescent they'd ever met in their lives. And they said they were the ones pulling the train by themselves, basically. They were having to be the grown-up. They said, however, they never sort of stopped enjoying the kind of fun of their partner, but they're like, you can't have fun when you're the only one who's remembering that the bills need to get paid and the stuff needs to get done, and they're playing the video games while you're trying to do all the things of life. That they'll say, I actually still love this person, and if I was still my 25-year-old self, we'd be having a ball, but at 40 with all the stuff, nah. And so there's grief around that too, because there's even a grief around wishing a partner might have been able to step up to the occasion. Or in some cases, Kyle, marriages end because there's too much stress. There's too many money problems. There's too many work problems. A lot of relationships really struggled, foundered, or even ended during the pandemic. That people wonder, had this thing not been dropped into our relationship, a big financial stress or a job loss or something like that, might we come out the other side? Maybe. You don't get to go in that. You don't get to have that choose your adventure, right? You're in the story you're in right now. And so that's something where there's grief around, could this have been different? I mean, certainly, possibly, but also this is the story as it's playing out now. And that introspection, that staying in the moment, understanding that this is how it is, and recognizing that those things, you can have grief about the stress and the pressure it put on you and all of that. So you're grieving so many things simultaneously. It actually is a very, very different sort of a grief experience. It almost has many, many facets, and it's almost like a big sphere of grief when people go through divorce. And I think that this idea that, oh, you're free now, is one of the worst things we could say to someone going through a divorce, is that rather than, this is hard and I hope you're okay, is probably the best thing anyone going through this is going through. And so I'm saying that to all of you going through this. This is hard and I hope you're okay.
Excellent. So I shouldn't say congratulations anymore when someone tells me they just got a divorce?
You can say it inside.
Yeah, right. Yeah. No problem. Thank you, Dr. Ramani. That was fantastic. A lot to unpack here. And as you do so, if you consider journaling it, I have some prompts for you. First prompt, what about this divorce are you grieving? List specific examples or general feelings. When do you typically feel your lowest or your worst? Now, when do you typically feel your best? Do you notice any triggers or patterns? List your 3 biggest fears or unknowns about this divorce. And if you feel comfortable, play out your worst case scenario. Identify how you can step in and do one small step in the right direction, and allocate at least one resource or person you can refer to when things get overwhelming. And I want to take a moment to just share a personal thought on that. Oftentimes I get emails from people, especially parents, who don't want to burden anybody else. They feel like it's their job to unburden everyone, and they don't want to lean on anyone for support. I can tell you that in most cases, your friends, your family, the people who have been with you through the ups and downs, they are ready. They are ready to support you. And sometimes it just takes you to actually accept the support. So lean on those friends. Finally, what are things we can do that fill us up in place of those first holidays and birthday experience changes? For example, maybe you can take an art class on your ex-spouse's birthday. I'm not taking any art classes, but I might go to a wine night. What is your phrase or word that you can repeat to yourself when you're having a difficult time? You can share these insights with the community, or you can report back to the community on how you applied one of these resources or actions and how it helped you through. In our next lesson, we're going to be talking about denial and acceptance, shame and guilt. See you there.
The challenge with denial, Kyle, is that it's a relatively unconscious process. Right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Right? There's a point at which denial can come up and like we might say, la, 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 I'm going to pretend nothing's happening. By definition, denial is a defense. It's a way that we psychologically keep ourselves safe from something that feels like it's threatening us, at a very core level. Denial is meant to be protective. That's what it exists for. So the functionality of it makes sense, but it can get people into some really messy places.
In this lesson, we're talking about primarily denial and acceptance. I'd like to start with acceptance, Dr. Ramani. I hear this in almost every mental health interview I do, that this power of acceptance can change everything. But what if I don't want to accept this? What do I do?
Acceptance isn't, you can't just say, I accept things and you automatically accept them. But otherwise, if one is sort of struggling, if a person is struggling for years against that kind of wall of acceptance, it causes a lot of distress, anxiety, depression, a whole host of sort of not feeling our best because you're sort of fighting an unwinnable battle. Someone's done, and accepting that is not an easy thing to do. And there's a lot of even issues around core wounds and abandonment and all of that can all make acceptance very, very difficult. But part of acceptance isn't just acceptance that this relationship's gone and I need to be okay with it. You don't ever need to be okay with it. And I think that's where we sort of misperceive the construct of acceptance, is that I need to be cool with this. Acceptance doesn't mean you're signing off on it. Acceptance is, this is difficult. Acceptance is, I'm sad. Acceptance is, at any given moment, I'm feeling a certain way and I'm not going to judge it. That's really when we're getting to the core of acceptance, is that I think that because we're let's say you're a year and a half out, 2 years, 5 years out from a divorce, and you're thinking, I'm such a loser. I can't believe I'm still crying about this. That's not acceptance. That's self-harm, right? Acceptance is, this is still really hard for me. Do you see the difference? And, and it is really hard for me, and I don't have to explain that away. And that's acceptance. And I think, again, we make this mistake that acceptance means we're signing off on the situation. And that's not necessarily so.
Yeah, great clarification. Now, this concept of denial, where do we see that commonly pop up in the divorce process?
I think denial pops up in the whole divorce process, even before people are even beginning to think about it. We're not having any problems. Everything's fine. We don't need to talk about this. We're going to figure it out. And so I think that it's the unwillingness to identify the myriad elephants in the room, which is what ultimately brings a relationship down. Every so often does a marriage end because of one, like a marriage was going along and then one bad thing happens and that's where the marriage falls apart? Yes, but that's not the norm. Marriages fall apart because 1,000 things go wrong. And then one day it just sort of, it dies from neglect, from contempt, from whatever, but it wasn't one big event. Again, that can happen, but it's not the norm. And so denial is also that everything's fine. Everything's fine. We have a good looking holiday picture, so everything's fine, right? And it's the coming out of the everything's fine of it all is denying that there are some real issues. And it's terrifying. It's terrifying to address and accept that something wrong is happening, because it means then something has to be done. Or maybe this relationship isn't going to work. But that denial is often what is a key part of the history of many relational issues. And had that denial not been in place, people might have been able to take potentially a more active role. It's hard to know. In some cases, no. I think some marriages simply cannot be fixed in any way, shape, or form. But in some cases, the denial meant things weren't addressed. As time goes on, though, denial can be things like, well, this is going to be easy and straightforward, or we're going to figure this out, or it's a denial of what's really ahead of you, right? Because people, I'll tell you, here, let me give you a great example of where denial comes in. And I'm thinking about a couple of scenarios that I've worked with clinically. Family court's going to see that I'm the better parent, and so I'm going to get full custody of my kids. And I'm thinking, then you have not, that's not going to happen. But if you're living in that denial, like, oh, I'm just going to tell the court, like, there are other parents not involved, and I'm the only one who's involved, and they're going to let me have 100% custody, and I'm going to get so much more money as a result. And they truly believe that that's denial. That's not understanding.
Why is that denial, though?
Because that's not how it works. I mean, if I can speak to California, which is the state I reside and practice in. Obviously, this is going to be tweaked in different states and obviously different regions of the world. But California is a state that's presumptively about 50-50 custody for each parent. And the only reason it won't be that is if one of the parents doesn't want it, right? So a parent might say, I work long hours. I know I can't step in. So they might have like a 70-30 setup where it's one weeknight and maybe every other weekend. But if one of the parents wants it, even if they really aren't qualified or set up to have that child 50% of the time, they will get that child 50% of the time. And I think that people think that they can make this sort of plea to the court saying, no, I'm more involved and I'm the one who always took them to their activities. But if that other parent wants to be involved in their children's lives at an amount up to 50%, they're going to get that. And then other people will think, but like we lived in this house and I love this house, so of course I'm going to get this house. And there's a bit of denial that there's rules and procedures. I mean, listen, I'm about to say something that's a little cynical, but if people actually read what divorce really means in their state before they got married, I think some people might think this one through a little bit. Because, listen, most people read their rental car contracts more carefully than they read what the ramifications of what a divorce would be in their state with regard to custody, with regard to assets, with regard to all of that. I don't think people understand terms like community property and joint legal custody and any of these things. And so as a result, people are often incredibly shocked at how it works, even though had you dug, you would have known there. But who does that? It's not what we think of doing when we're getting into a marriage with someone. Obviously, maybe at a second marriage, somebody might be thinking that way, but not the first time around. So there can be denial of that there are policies and procedures. There may be denial about how badly this is going to go. For people who are in relationships with people who are narcissistic or antagonistic or toxic, there may be denial about how bad this is going to go and how many hundreds of thousands of dollars potentially can go out the window to lawyers before this whole thing is over. So I think that all of those pieces of denial can get people very, very sort of stuck, because and this is where acceptance and denial are in a very different, interesting sort of a dance with each other, right? Because denial is going to subvert acceptance. Acceptance is like, okay, I see what this is going to be, and this is not necessarily going to be easy. Again, this is where I keep coming back to this point of acceptance isn't that big sort of shiny eraser that makes it all good. Acceptance can actually often be a heck of a lot more uncomfortable than denial, because in denial, you can say like, this is all going to be fine. Of course it's going to work out. Of course the courts are going to be fair. Acceptance is, this is not going to work out smoothly and the courts are not going to be fair, and I need to be prepared for what's coming my way.
So is our job to try and identify where our denial is creeping up and move it towards acceptance?
The challenge with denial, Kyle, is that it's a relatively unconscious process.
Right? Exactly. Yeah.
Right? There's a point at which denial can come up and like we might say, la, 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 I'm going to pretend nothing's happening. And that's a bit more, like that might be aware denial, if you will. But by definition, denial is a defense. It's a way that we psychologically keep ourselves safe from something that feels like it's threatening us, at a very core level. So we practice denial. And that to convert denial into acceptance often needs a led conversation. Therapy is often the place where the kind of the lid gets lifted off of denial because it's a safe place, but the therapist simultaneously is also able to work with the client to understand historically what it is that happened, so the person starts to understand the part of themselves that they're trying to protect. Denial is meant to be protective. That's what it exists for. So the functionality of it makes sense, but it can get people into some really messy places.
I mean, I have been in my psychiatrist office, who is also my therapist, and he is looking me in the eye going, Kyle, you are in denial. You are in denial. And I'm going, you don't know anything, and I'm not in denial. Well, I was in denial.
Yeah, more denial.
And he's telling me I'm in denial. And I still didn't admit I was in denial. So this is somebody that I'm paying, who's an expert, who I trust, telling me this, and I'm still refuting it. How do I begin to uncover my own denials? It seems like an impossible task.
It is sort of an uncomfortable, I mean, it is sort of an impossible task. And I might have approached it by saying, in telling yourself this, how is that protecting you, Kyle?
Oh, that would have been a good answer. Or a
Right?
good question.
And that's how I would approach a client's like, how does this protect you by seeing
That
it
would
this
have been a
way or
great
being it
question.
this way? And,
Yeah.
and then 9 times out of 10, a client will say, this is, yep, it is protecting me. And so then we understand denial becomes a little bit of a friend, right? Like, okay, this is sort of helping you and it's protecting you. So let's not be mad at denial. However, this is sort of a friend that might not be doing you like this right at this juncture, and maybe stopping you from seeing this situation clearly. And so the therapist role is to create a safe holding space so that we can sort of start. And I honestly, the visual I give clients is like, you have all this concrete, and I'm like, here's a sledgehammer, because we're going to have to start cracking this thing up. So we can see through this, and you're going to see down through what's on the other side. But it's work to take that sledgehammer and break up that concrete to see what's on the other side, because that concrete is a wall that might be protecting you from falling into the water or falling off a cliff or something like that. Well, this is what's there. And that's where it is, but it's a false protection, because inevitably you're headed towards that cliff.
Yeah. Let's jump back to acceptance, specifically this concept of radical acceptance. Does that play a role in this process?
Radical acceptance plays a part depending on the situation. I mean, radical acceptance is sort of the kind of like it's the understanding that a circumstance is simply not going to change. That's not always true, right? So acceptance is a person, like we'll use that term in something like, okay, this hurts right now. Okay, this is uncomfortable right now. This isn't getting better right now. See how I'm saying right now? So we're allowing sort of that present moment. We're aware that what this is right now isn't cool. Radical acceptance is, this is never going to change. This is never going to be different, right? Yeah. So the radicalness of it is the neverness of it. Like there's no, and that terminology, in my work, it's very much focused on what happens in antagonistic relationships. These are relationships like narcissism. They're not likely to change. So decisions have to be made in these relationships from the place of, if this person's never going to change, how are you going to proceed? So in the divorce world, the way this shows up is that, let's say you are continually fighting over this little financial issue, one little thing, one bank account, with the narcissistic person. Radical acceptance is, they're never letting go of this. You're about to spend $50,000 on a $25,000 bank account. They're not letting go. And some people say, it's the principle. We're supposed to split stuff down the middle. I'm like, you're not splitting stuff down the middle. And I have worked with many attorneys trying to get a client to a place of, especially in these narcissistic kinds of divorces, where you're not going to get what you're entitled to by law. You're going to have to sit down and figure out the number you can live with, because that might be more realistic. So this is where radical acceptance comes to play. There's no way the narcissistic person's going to meet you on what the actual legal, ethical number is. But if you can have in the back of your head that other number that you could work with, that you can live with, that will allow you to parent your children the way you want, that's radical acceptance in practice.
How do we build our radical acceptance muscle?
This is not an easy one. Again, radical acceptance is sort of, to me, a sort of a unique kind of a sidebar in the whole divorce world, because there is an unchangeability. Let's face it, nobody is at their most graceful when they're in the heat of a divorce, but you can still see the friend that's there. You know that they're not a truly difficult person. It's just a difficult circumstance. And you can even envision a friendship down the road. That's not going to be the case in this sort of sidebar, radical acceptance, narcissistic, antagonistic kind of divorce situation. How do you get there? Education. Understanding what you're up against, looking for patterns. So a person who's been through a truly antagonistic relationship will say, other than that little love bombing time, this has been a tough relationship. I'm frequently manipulated. I'm frequently gaslighted. I'm frequently invalidated. I'm frequently criticized. I have been betrayed. This person is not holding up their side of the relationship, and they never have. Not from the jump, not 5 years ago, not now. It's that consistency. Whereas in a relationship where this kind of need for radical acceptance, or there isn't this kind of narcissism present, people will say, you know what, we had a really good run for a while, and then the industry they were in took a downturn, and they were pretty mad at the world, and they were mad at me, and we lost ourselves. But I still see their goodness, right? They'll say it wasn't always this. There was something very circumstantial that caused a change in things, or whatever, something like that. So it was something where the other person in the relationship, not the narcissistic person, will feel, a person in a narcissistic relationship feels they're partly to blame. A person in a healthy relationship where it falls apart will say, stuff happened, we both had played a role in it. I know it's not all me. I know it's not all them. That kind of balance sort of thing, that's not what you're dealing with. And I'm not so sure that radical acceptance is needed there. It's understand now it's difficult. It's going to be difficult for a minute. However, there may be a path forward. You're just going to have to give life a chance. That's not happening in those other circumstances where radical acceptance is so essential.
Yeah, I can imagine being in that acceptance state and having a good intentioned, well-meaning friend telling me, yeah, but things will get better. It's going to be okay. And me rolling my eyes and going, yeah, but right now it's not.
It's not.
And I need you to be with me here right now, because it's not. Yeah.
And I think that when people say things like, it's going to get better someday, listen, most sentient human beings know, life's going to change, right? But that idea of acceptance is, in this moment, it is the way it is. And part of even the work, for example, even look at acceptance and commitment therapy, is that, and it's not always going to be like this, right? It's as though the weather is the way it is. And then we think the weather's going to be like this every day of our lives. This is not the case, right? It's sunny today, and it could very well be raining next week. And I can't, or if it's raining, say it's not going to rain forever. It's just not how it works. And so it's a bit like taking that model of how things are going to be in a forever flux, but acceptance is acceptance of change. And acceptance that some moments are tough. And that's very different than radical acceptance of this particular thing is not going to change. And so I've got to make my decisions accordingly.
We mentioned shame and guilt at the top of this lesson. When we're feeling so guilty or so shameful, and I'll even add, we're just mad and angry, what emotion or regulation techniques are your go-to, Dr. Ramani?
Mm-hmm. So when it comes to emotional regulation, when you're feeling these strong negative emotions like shame or guilt or anger, there's a wide variety of tools that people can use. One, obviously the go-to that often works great is breathing. Those 3 intentional deep breaths with a slow exhale. And even if you can visualize on that exhale, like, okay, I'm letting this anger go. It's surfing right out on the top of that breath. Just the breath reorients us, because when we're angry and we're having negative emotions, we tend to breathe more shallow. And all that recycled air actually communicates to our brain that something's going wrong. It's like the sort of panicky feel. So those deep breaths can be very, very cleansing. Depending on how, your own life history or how difficult this relationship is, sometimes even just grounding to your body. And some of that might be, putting a hand to your chest. It could be putting a hand to your pulse. It could even be hugging yourself. Some people can find that to be sort of a regulation in the moment. Emotional regulation, though, can also be met by changing up your surroundings. I always say, whenever you can, take the roof off. Step outside. Find a balcony, find a front step, go take the elevator down and leave the building, and be with the sky above you. There's something about that that can also feel grounding. And it's sort of a change in circumstance. We tend to associate our discomfort with the situation with the things around us. So just to look at something different for a minute, and changing things up for a minute can always make a difference. It might mean, changing, whether it's washing your hands, splashing water on your face, or going all in and taking a shower or something. That can also sort of change, sort of how you're feeling in a moment. Asking for a minute. Saying like, can I have a second? And then going to another space and, whatever you do, you might bite like a towel, you may like do that one of those, but then you'll come out of it and then step out of that situation. Again, it's okay to have strong emotions. It's just sort of how we show up with those emotions matters. But I think if we can give ourselves, we can touch into our bodies, into our physiology, because our bodies hold a lot of that emotion. If we can change up sort of our surroundings, sometimes it's even plain old distraction. Whether it is for a moment you read something, you listen to a song that you find uplifting. Music is actually really interesting in how quickly it can sometimes re-regulate us. Whatever that could be, it could be even a quick TV show or inspirational video or something that you watch. You're like, okay, I feel it. But it's amazing how those kinds of sensory stimuli can just sort of pull us off into another direction. But there's a lot of different ways. But I think more than anything with regulation, Kyle, it's the stop. Stop, recognize that you're starting to feel overwhelmed, and then do something to address it. That's really, it's the catching it before the ball rolls too far down the hill and giving yourself permission to do it. Sometimes we just need a minute.
Thank you, Dr. Ramani. Dr. Ramani has talked a lot this lesson on cognitive behavioral therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy. You may have heard her use the phrase CBT and ACT during this lesson. If you are interested in learning more about those therapies, MedCircle has great series and workshops on them. I particularly am a fan of acceptance and commitment therapy. It's really rooted in mindfulness. And look, the person who taught me mindfulness is Dr. Ramani, okay? And it is a game changer, and it seems overwhelming and hard to do. And I'm not saying it's super, super easy, but little tiny steps consistently make a huge impact. I really recommend learning about mindfulness on this journey. In our next lesson, we're going to talk about how to address those hard topics during the divorce process.
Ask anyone who's ever been betrayed, and the day they learned the betrayal, the reaction was physiological. Yeah. It was your heart beating out of your chest. It was your throat constricting. The physiological reaction is the first one. And I guess the one thing I want to tell anyone is that if you felt that, that's right on point. Because think about it. Your entire world was just upended. From there on in, though, Kyle, it gets tricky. Because for some people, it is sheer unfettered rage. Basically, the how could you? If you just picked up a device and learned that your partner was cheating on you, or you opened up a bank statement and realized there's no money left and they're responsible, there's no sort of woo-woo, love and light way to respond. People will be enraged. However, after that initial anger passes and that initial anger goes through you, you will be depleted like you've never been depleted in your life.
Dr. Ramani, divorce is often accompanied by other hard topics. Maybe that is betrayal, maybe that's financial stress, etc. How do we first begin to deal with all of these other hard topics that come with the divorce?
Well, I mean, the hard topics are often the cause of the divorce. Keep that in mind, too. So it's almost hard to extract the one from the other. And I think, again, this is one more reminder that divorce is on a continuum, right? That divorce is always difficult, but sometimes the kinds of things that sort of led up to the divorce may not have the same kinds of heaviness in terms of betrayal or, financial harm or all of that. So it's obviously going to be different in every divorce situation. For people who have gone through significant betrayal, and that betrayal doesn't just have to be infidelity. It could be lies that were told about family finances or other things going on in the person's life that have now sort of destabilized not only sort of the practical situation for a family, but really destabilized any sense of trust there was in a relationship. And what we have to understand is what betrayal does to us. What betrayal does is it leaves us feeling very unsafe in the world, because betrayal is undertaken by somebody we believe we trusted and loved, and who we believed that would trust and love us and not put us in a perilous position. And here now they have. So your entire version of what the world is turned upside down. And that is an unsettling feeling. And if it happens repeatedly in a relationship, it qualifies as something we call betrayal trauma, which can create a real sense of unsafety in the world at large. So this isn't just as simple as being mad at a cheating spouse. It's this deeper, profound sense of betrayal. And in these cases, again, some of the reactions of people who have been betrayed in very, very big ways or repeated ways look very much like we'd see in any sort of post-traumatic reaction. And trauma-informed therapy and any form of therapy really become absolutely essential at that point.
Is there one thing that we should do first? And when I say first, I mean the very first thing. As soon as we have learned about the betrayal, what do we do next?
I mean, Kyle, it's a tough one. Ask anyone who's ever been betrayed, and the day they learned the betrayal, the reaction was physiological.
Yeah.
It was your heart beating out of your chest. It was your throat constricting. It was an elephant on your chest. It was, you felt like people could see your heart beating out of your chest. It was air rushing out of your lungs. These are the many reactions that clients have shared with me over the years at that moment of recognizing that a betrayal was happening. Many people would feel like almost this panicky kind of, the world turns black except for this one sort of spot. So this is the physiological reaction is the first one. And I guess the one thing I want to tell anyone is that if you felt that, that's right on point. Because think about it. Your entire world was just upended. That is, we experience that as a huge threat, and our threat response tends to be physiological. So that's what often happens first. From there on in, though, Kyle, it gets tricky, because for some people, it is sheer unfettered rage. Basically, the how could you? And I am not going to sit here and think that any human being out there can be a robot. If you just picked up a device and learned that your partner was cheating on you, or you opened up a bank statement and realized there's no money left and they're responsible, there's no sort of woo-woo, love and light way to respond. People will be enraged. And if you're angry, be angry. Physical is never allowed, but you may be screaming at top volume if you can be aware of kids, but you may be not. And again, this is where I'm saying you got to show yourself grace. I have been in this position and it was not pretty. Though I was able to get out of that space away from people. If they heard it, it would have been very upsetting for them. So I just, was able to get the betrayer out of the circumstance into a car, and then there was a sort of, I did not realize that Dr. Romani went to that volume, but apparently she does. So that it was, and I think any of us who have been betrayed have been there. And there is anger, and no judging yourself on that anger, because again, in some ways to me, that anger is really that fight response, that sympathetic fight response, that's not a bad thing. Again, your body keeping you safe. You're going after the thing that harmed you. That makes sense. It's like fighting off an animal that's chasing you down the street. It's the same thing. However, after that initial anger passes and that initial anger goes through you, you will be depleted like you've never been depleted in your life. And that's when people will say it felt like the world was collapsing, because now some people will go to a place of either denial or something that's termed by Dr. Jennifer Fried as betrayal blindness. They will, they don't want to see it any longer, because if you see it, it means you have to do something about it, and do something about it may mean you have to end the relationship, or you have to address it. You have to talk about it, and to avoid doing that, there may be that mechanism, which isn't just denial. Betrayal blindness is this attempt to maintain the connection with the person who harmed you because you need to, because you feel like you have to, because you feel attached to this person. And so There are a lot of things that by some people at that point, once they come down off that initial anger reaction, some people will say, I'm done, and they will start quickly deciding to get out. Some people will seek out counsel. I think one of the best things you can do is try to talk to someone, because having a person you can share this with who doesn't blame you or pathologize you or ask you if you heard it right, but that person who hears it and walks you through it calmly, lovingly, but not questioning you, that can actually be the thing that literally saves a person's sanity. Because now it's as though you're taking this thing that almost feels incomprehensible and sharing it with another person. Not everyone has that kind of person in their lives, but for those who do, it's often the best thing you could possibly do. But shame can hold people back from doing that. The sense of, if I tell this person that my husband cheated on me, now if I don't end this relationship, this person now always knows my husband cheated on me. So some people already go into that mode of like, what am I and who and what and where am I trying to protect things here? So it's not always easy. Some people will contact a therapist right away and say, this is what I found. And many a therapist will do an emergency call under those kinds of circumstances. So there's different places that people might go. But it is that initial reaction, I'm going to be frank with you, when there's a big, big betrayal like that, that threatens sort of the sense that I use the word safety, like running out of money or recognizing that somebody betrayed your trust in that way, that is a threat to psychological safety. The reactions tend to be very physiological. There tends to be a lot of anger and despair, and those are never our most graceful moments.
Could you even say, though, that having this big outburst feeling, anger, rage, is good? Because if you don't have that, then there's no release, so to speak, of all of those emotions?
Depends on how you do it. I mean, again, like I said, Kyle, there sometimes can be long-term ramifications if this is done in front of children. If this is done in front of, I don't know, you're doing it on the phone in the workplace or something like that, it could definitely have longer term consequences. So you do have to be aware that the context sort of matters. Obviously, it's never going to be acceptable if it includes anything that involves any form of physical harm or physically, at least physical harm to the other. You may break a dish or throw something down, but you've got to be very aware of yourself in that space and the risk to others in that environment. It's just that's you finding a way to express that anger. Yes, I do think that there's a release. It is sharing of yourself. It's not bottling that up. I mean, again, the fight response is actually showing that you believe you don't deserve to be treated this way, right? It's saying that I'm angry because this is not okay. And as long as you know this is not okay, there is a sense of self you are fighting for. To me, that's a good thing. Right? So but it is sort of the approach to anger, because again, there could be long-term ramifications and consequences depending how it's managed in that moment. But I think that having anger, and not just in that moment, but on an ongoing basis, that anger is still a motivator to say, this isn't okay, there needs to be change, and I'm worth fighting for.
In our discussions about divorce, we've kind of alluded to, maybe inaccurately, that once this person's divorced, then the ex-spouse has no ability to abuse that person anymore. But they do, especially if they're tied to any financials, kids, etc. So how do we come to terms with the divorce as well as protect ourselves from potential ongoing abuse from the spouse, our ex-spouse?
Yeah, so this is very real because a divorce is, I mean, it's a lot easier to get married than it is to get divorced. And divorce takes time. In California, for example, it's at least 6 months from, in the quickest version of events, from filing for and then it to be completed. This is going to vary in different states in the United States. Some states have cooling off periods. Some religions have cooling off periods, right? And so this isn't as simple as I'm done, we're divorced. So
Yes.
as a result of that, it's not as simple as, we're done. Now, in the process of the divorce, especially during the divorce process, if you are dealing with somebody who's particularly narcissistic or antagonistic, you may see something that is termed post-separation abuse. And post-separation abuse is a very real and at times very dangerous phenomenon where you might see escalation in certain behaviors, including ongoing financial abuse, hiding money, shutting down accounts that shouldn't be shut down, stalking someone, putting surveillance on someone, passing rumors about them, saying bad things about them in public forums like social media, dismantling someone's reputation. Post-separation abuse is not uncommon in antagonistic, like I said, divorces with folks who are narcissistic or really toxic. That can happen there. But even if it's not full on that, there still could be these experiences of somebody who's being quite punitive financially, waiting until exactly 11:59 p.m. to deposit money that they're supposed to deposit that you were already planning on using for other bills that were going to get paid. There could be petty things. There could be the sense of, somebody saying negative things about you to people who you might work with, who are in your community, who are involved in your children's school. Obviously, people who have the most severe version of sort of relational abuse, above and beyond what we see in physical or other forms of abuse, would be coercive control. That sense of keeping someone in place and stuck in a relationship through sort of fear, menace, the threat of violence or harm, and isolation, and financial abuse and isolation. Those are very difficult situations for a person to extricate themselves from. But if a person does manage to do that, in those situations, almost invariably, there will be post-separation abuse. And a lot of people aren't expecting that. They're not expecting that kind of post-separation abuse, or what we could even call sort of legal abuse. A person using the legal system around a divorce to abuse a person, being uncooperative with processes in the divorce, like the discovery process or producing documents, continually sort of tinkering with custody agreements, drawing out certain legal decisions, and actually asking for all these documents to be reviewed and re-reviewed, which can also deplete a person's finances. And so that combination of the financial abuse, the legal abuse, all of these things can escalate in a way that people will say that it was actually the period of the divorce and that process that was even more harmful and even traumatizing than the actual relationship.
Yeah. So if we're experiencing post-separation abuse, yes, we can go to therapy. Yes, I have some emotional regulation techniques, but is there anything else we can do to manage that?
You need a good attorney. I'm not even going to mince words on that one.
Yeah.
You need a good attorney, and you need an attorney who gets this. I mean, I always say to people that the ringer is, if your attorney's saying, well, everyone who's going through a divorce thinks their ex is narcissistic, I'm like, this ain't your person. You need a person who understands that some people show up very differently in the process of going through proceedings like divorce proceedings, where they feel out of control, right? And they're going to get that control back any way they can. So I do think that having somebody who's good legal counsel, who gets this and can walk you through this, becomes important. And if not that, some form of advocate. And if the post-separation abuse is escalating, you may actually need a domestic violence advocate or social worker who is working with you to sort of protect you and sort of help, kind of keep you sort of psychologically and even physically safe during this process. So you need a strategy when you're in one of these situations. And it's not, I think a lot of people got to understand, it's one thing if a person is doing things that are ostensibly problematic, like putting tracking devices on your car, which are getting easier and easier all the time, or engaging in surveillance or stalking you. Those things are often those are more in your face. But a lot of what happens in post-separation abuse is subtle psychological stuff. Is like, oh, you really think that someone as well-connected as me in this town is going to lose at this? That's not against the law. Right? And so when a person tries to get this addressed in family court, and you got to understand, there's a really big divorce industrial complex out there. There's a lot of people making a lot of money when there's a divorce, which results in the abuse of people in these processes, dragging it out, making it cost a lot of money. I'm saying this to sort of break the gaslighting that a lot of people go through. They're saying, this system seems really messed up. It is messed up. And unfortunately, that's the only system we've got. And so people are ending up spending lots of money that they don't need to spend because because they're not getting taught what this is. But when a person's going through this, understand it's real. And I think a lot of people try to poop it, oh, divorces are hard for everyone. No. This isn't that normal level of difficult. And so people do need advocates. They may need legal guidance. They're definitely going to need therapeutic support to understand that this is what's happening. And some people sort of, like I said, that's why sort of having this realistic sense on sort of how much of a settlement here would work for you, even if it's not going to be fair. That to say, I can live with this so you can get yourself out of the contentiousness of this process. And there are other tactics too. It's things like not getting in the mud, not using terminology like narcissist or gaslighting, terms that the family court often take umbrage at people using. You have to be careful in your languaging. So it's about being prepared and understanding that it's very painful to watch a person who was being so cruel or harmful or yelling at you be so charming and charismatic in a courtroom setting while you feel like you're falling apart inside. And so all of these things are the things that people need to be prepared for when they're in these more severe circumstances, when there's harmful things happening afterwards. But Kyle, you got to remember too, these difficult situations also on a continuum. Some people may go through where there's not post-separation abuse, but there was, for example, an infidelity, right? Mm-hmm. And then the person with whom the spouse had the affair, now the spouse is going into a relationship with them, now that the marriage is coming to an end, and very quickly wanting to share. They're wanting to sort of introduce their children to this person they cheated on the parent with, and that's not acceptable. That is harmful to that other parent. And so, but the children can't advocate for themselves. They don't know. And the person who might have cheated on someone think, well, I'm ready to move into the sunset with this new person. And so that sort of stuff can also be incredibly overwhelming. And it's the sort of stuff where the court's going to say, well, it's not against the law for your partner to move into a new relationship, but can be addressed potentially at the level of the parenting arrangement and those other places. So it is about working closely with an attorney and other advocates to ensure that these needs get heard, because it can feel really devastating to be betrayed in this way and then almost feel like someone's snapping into your old life. That it feels like betrayal upon betrayal. And like I said, the courts aren't often set up to deal with this, but the person who is experiencing these betrayals needs people around them to help them support themselves through it so they don't feel crazy. Because many people in these situations are told, oh, you're being petty, you can't let go. This isn't about being petty or not being able to let go. This is about real pain. And this is also about protecting children from a situation that they may not developmentally be ready to understand.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the locus of control. What is this concept, and how can understanding it help us through the divorce process?
So locus of control is an interesting concept. Although it's been around, people would argue even back in the day of William James, we were talking about this. The person who really brought this into, where we talked about it in terms of research and theory is a guy named Dr. Jules Roeder, who, fun fact, was once my professor years ago. I took a graduate class when I was an undergrad. He was at the brilliant Department of Psychology at the University of Connecticut, and I had the opportunity to take a class with him. And so locus of control, 1958 is around where we're seeing some of the papers on this, and it's this idea of it got to this idea of how we make attributions, right? How much do we think that we have control within us over the things that are happening to us versus we feel that the world around us, things like luck and fate and randomness are what's dictating what happens. The higher an internal locus of control we have, the more we feel less anxious. We are more likely to sort of take an active hand in what's happening in our lives and feel more in control of it. And we feel a greater sense of predictability.
You're saying that the more that we feel like we effect or create our environment, the better we feel.
Correct. But I have to say the locus of control construct was developed in the 1950s, where we didn't account for things like the differential power and marginalizations people can carry in the world. And so,
Yes.
listen, for some people, they are being much more buffeted by things in the external world, whether that's secondary to lack of economic resources, whether that's due to other forms of abuse, whether that's due to discrimination. So I think that locus of control construct was still based on a heyday in psychology where everything was really based on majority race folks. And so as we crack that construct open, we still do know that even people who are being sort of buffeted more by the stuff happening in life, the idea that you still do feel some internal sense that you're able to do something and have, sort of captain your own ship at some point, or feel that there's things you can do, even if they're small things. Maintaining that internal locus of control is still associated with better outcomes, but it's a complicated construct in some ways.
So if I'm in the courtroom and my spouse is being charming and incredible and wooing over the entire courtroom, but I know for a fact this is not how he treated me, I could lean on my locus of control I'm asking if I could lean on my locus of control in a different way, saying I don't have control on how he acts in the courtroom. That is not in my
Correct.
control.
I can't
Got it.
exactly. So,
So it goes back to acceptance again.
It goes back to acceptance, but I'm also going to draw this out. It's a great exercise for people to do, okay? Take a piece of paper and draw a big circle in that paper and put inside the circle the things you can control. I can come into the courtroom prepared. I can come in with all my documentation. I could have done breathing exercises the day before. Could have touched base with my therapist and my attorney the night before and that's all within the circle. What's outside the circle? The judge you get. You don't have any choice in that. How your narcissistic partner behaves that day. You may not have control over the amount of traffic going to the courtroom. You do have control inside the circle of what time you leave. You see what I'm saying? So once you put outside and inside the locus of control or that control circle, and focus on the things inside the circle, that can also be a way to say, okay, I'm working on the sense of I know what I can control in this situation, and what I can't control is the stuff outside of this circle.
I'm reminded of the Serenity Prayer. I don't know it off the top of my hand. Do you know it, Dr. Ramani, by
What is
chance?
it? God grant me the courage to change the things I can, accept the things I can't, and then there's something else. I don't remember.
Yeah, essentially it's about accepting what we can and
changing what we can, accepting what we can't change. And I think that is
being
it's
able
a
to know
tough
the
way to
difference.
live though, Kyle, especially when a person feels like they're being buffeted by so many forces. Basically, you had a life and now you're not going to have that life anymore. And people outside of you are making these absolutely enormous decisions where your kids are going to live, how often they're going to live, where your kids are going to spend Thanksgiving, making these enormous decisions outside of you. There's few processes in your life where you're going to feel like a lot of the stuff that's happening is outside that locus. But the concept of locus of control, though, is also how you perceive all of this, right? Because one could say a person who has a high internal locus of control can say, I can accept. I have the capacity to accept how my ex is going to behave in the courtroom. That's still a high internal locus of control because it's the sense of I can do that. I can accept. I'm able to understand what it is within me I can do. But like I said, that's not easy when a lot of stuff exterior to you is what's contributing to the amount of distress and grief and discomfort you're enduring in your life.
Yeah, of course. Well, thank you for this information, Dr. Ramani. This was very helpful and eye-opening. Of course, I have some prompts for our dear viewer. If you would like to journal these and share with our community, feel free. Here are some ideas for you. Number one, ask yourself, what is the emotion you are feeling the most during this stage of your divorce? You can follow up with a secondary question. How do you act on this emotion typically? And then ask yourself, what do you instead want to feel? Another question is, what is one thing you can remember in this situation that can keep you focused on your future rather than resorting to your past with this person? If you feel comfortable, share this insight with the community to see if you can help another person through this in a new way. In our next lesson, we're going to talk about correlated mental health issues that often pop up during the divorce process, and of course, how to handle them.
I would say the one mistake that people make is that they don't hold space to treat the divorce as grief and loss and all the stress and sadness and negative emotions that go through that, meaning that the divorce is just a problem to be solved versus
Right.
the thing that has set off this huge series of emotional reactions, right?
Certainly, divorce, Dr. Ramani, can bring up a lot of feelings and emotions, and sometimes these actually get to the point of a mental health diagnosis, or maybe we had something, we're living with something already, and now this divorce has really sprung it into front and center. I can't imagine how, if I was going through a divorce and living with depression, where I would even begin to start to tease out how to handle all of this. Should I be going into therapy to talk about my depression that I've had for the last few years, or do I need to focus on what's happening today, which is this divorce?
So again, mental health, the mental health fallout from divorce is very real. And when we think about how we go into therapy, we talk about the things that are distressing us, that are uncomfortable, and those may all be related to each other, right? In person, like you said, Kyle, there's sort of two versions of this. There could be the version where somebody is depressed and they already had a history of depression, and now the divorce on top of that has become a new stressor that's going to probably make the depressive symptomatology worse or the anxiety symptomatology worse, whatever a person was struggling with. But it could also be the ongoing chronic stress of the marital issues that culminated in divorce, and the stress of the divorce can actually be the catalyst for a significant mental health crisis. No matter what, divorce is stressful, and stress is often, again, a predictor or, again, a catalyst of the onset of significant mental health symptomatology or a frank mental health diagnosis or disorder. So there's a lot of things that can be happening simultaneously. In terms of how we approach it therapeutically, when someone comes in, we don't need to tease the two apart. We're just not going to focus on the divorce. We're not just going to focus on depression separately. We're going to talk about how these things are related and put it in a context. A person might say, I was doing fine, my depression was so well controlled, and now it's not. Well, because a significant stressor can really throw a person, or a person who has had maybe, for example, a past history of post-traumatic stress disorder or even complex trauma, and then the onset of divorce can really, really inflame that existing, the existing symptomatology. So there's a lot of different ways this can play out, and then the divorce is going to be viewed as a significant stressor that the therapist is going to want to work with the client in terms of learning to cope with it, learning to manage the stress associated with it, but also manage the acute distress raised by mental health issues. Because one thing we never want is we want to treat things as early as possible before they start becoming more and more severe.
So if I came into a therapist because I was struggling with my divorce, and then the therapist diagnosed me with depression, could I go on a med for the depression, but then because my depression is lessened by going on this medication, I would then be better able to handle the rigmarole of going through this divorce?
In some cases, when a person, for example, might meet diagnostic criteria for a depressive episode or some sort of related mood disorder, and they're finding that, especially if their symptomatology is around more of what we call the neurovegetative stuff, the low energy, the exhaustion, the sleep problems, the appetite issues, they may be put on medication and might find that and it takes a minute. Remember, antidepressants are not instant, 4,
That's right.
6, 8 weeks, that as they sort of experience some of that uplift secondary to the medication, they may feel, again, better sort of buttressed to deal with the harms and the stresses and the all the stuff that comes from the divorce. I think what people need to understand, and this has always been the conversation when it comes to antidepressants, especially when that depression was definitely sort of kicked off by being in or maintaining a very significant psychosocial stressor like a divorce, is that the medication isn't going to make the divorce better. It's not going to, you're still going through something that's extremely stressful. That's still going to be the cause of a lot of distress. So it's really, really important to remember that is, it's not, there's no such thing as a magic pill. But some people, especially people who have historically had sort of major depressive episode with the sort of the hills and the valleys and the periods of time where the episodes are worse, they may find that being on a medication or an upping of their dose of medication may help them as they navigate this crisis. But it's the medication alone is never going to be enough. It really has to be embedded in a larger structure of psychotherapy and other supports so that the person can practice, again, skills like mindfulness or other coping skills to help a person navigate what is a very difficult circumstance.
A lot of people going through divorce find themselves drinking more, maybe partying more, indulging more. How do we look at substance use as something that says, okay, yeah, you can have some wine, you're going through a divorce, as opposed to, whoa, this is maladaptive, this is not healthy?
So it's maladaptive coping when a person is turning to drugs or alcohol to address the difficult emotions of the divorce. So it's quite a different thing to say, I'm going to go out and have a social experience with friends and enjoy wine and some food and that's very different than I don't want to feel this way, so I am going to.
What if I just do it one time, though? I had a terrible day at court. I go home. I have a whole bottle of wine on my couch because it sucked. And I know what I'm doing. I'm literally... Yeah, go ahead.
That's normal. I mean, again, the key is that that's normal, but it can't become the norm. If that, see, does that make sense? So it is normal to want to do that. It's normal to want, on some days, to want to make it all go away that way, and people will do that. But you don't want that to be, well, that worked last week in court, so next month I have another deposition, so I'm going to do that as well, because now you're going to wake up with the same problem and a headache, but also the risk of turning to this as an ongoing sort of strategy. Listen, drugs and alcohol, if you want to say it, work for a minute. You're no longer thinking about things, whether it's people using marijuana, whether it's people using alcohol. It definitely makes it makes the problem it numbs you, it pulls you out of it. You might just sort of fall asleep, all the things that you might be harder to do, but it can be a very, very slippery slope. And I also want to put in a little kind of an add-on here. If you are going through a divorce and it's a particularly contentious, difficult divorce, and word gets out that you're drinking more or you're using substances, you better believe that if you have an antagonistic partner who would like to weaponize that and use that, it will be. And that is one of those things that is measurable and observable. I even tell people I am working with who are going through these kinds of divorces, I don't want to see one social media picture with you holding a glass of champagne or anything. Like you've got to be that on top of it, because sadly, it's a new world with all this stuff. Even though this it's been a few decades of the social media stuff, the way this stuff is sometimes brought into these proceedings to paint a picture that can be very deceptive of somebody who is drinking too much, who may not be capable of caring for kids. You've got to get into that, and sadly, get into a mindset where you're trying to say, how could this be used against me? And so, but obviously though, Kyle, that's a tactical thing. But when it's coming down to a person finding that every day coming home and using marijuana or drinking or whatever people are coming home to do to lift that negative mood state, before long, if that starts becoming a habit and then that becomes something that someone's relying on, that now you're getting into, much, much more dangerous territory with the risk of developing a substance use disorder or a frank addiction. So it's not, like I said, somebody one bad day, you throw some back, okay, it's going to happen, be self-forgiving, but it can't be a go-to. And there's tactical issues where it could actually be tricky and problematic.
I would imagine, or in the stressful times in my life where I've been depressed or anxious or stressed or lonely, and I could point to the reason, it kind of made me feel like, well, if I know the reason, then it's okay. And I would dismiss all of those feelings because, of course, I felt like that. I'm going through a divorce. Are there anything that people could experience and unintentionally glaze over because they blame it on the divorce, when really, when they experienced it, it should have been a flag that said, I got to listen to that. I got to act on this?
I would say the one mistake that people make is that they don't hold space to treat the divorce as grief and loss and all the stress and sadness and negative emotions that go through that, meaning that the divorce is just a problem to be solved versus
Right.
the thing that has set off this huge series of emotional reactions, right? And because it's a legal matter, right? We view it as almost like the same thing as a neighbor suing us over a fence. It's not the same thing, right? Yeah. Yes, they're both stressful, but this is much, much more primal. It's going at things like family and children and love and abandonment, much, much more primitive stuff. And I think that a lot of people feel like they can problem solve their way out of it. And you can't just problem solve. There's also a period of feeling that has to happen. And to your point, Kyle, is that the divorce is such an identifiable stressor. A person like, oh, I'm just having this tough time because I'm going through divorce. I'm going to be fine in 6 months or a year or whatever. Pay attention to those feelings because it may be, but it also may not be. And I think that we forget is that, in fact, we often know that the first onset episode of depression for people can be caused by significant stress that happens, right? The problem with depression, though, is once you have one major depressive episode, the probability of having another goes way up. So and in essence, we don't talk about this enough, that we need to be depression protective. We don't want that first episode, because once episode 1 comes, more likely for 2. Once 2 comes, much more likely for 3. Once we get to 3, 4, and 5, you're definitely now in a cycle. And that first one could be caused by this level of stress. So sort of,
Right.
Recognizing that this symptomatology, sure, the divorce could be contributing to this, but that doesn't mean you would treat these symptoms any differently than if they were happening outside of the context of a divorce.
We have an insightful series on depression with psychiatrist Dr. Sue Varma, and it is included in your MedCircle library, so make sure you check that out if that topic resonates with you. Dr. Ramani, when it comes to our children, what should we be on the lookout for with their mental health?
So when it comes to our children, listen, children are always tricky to watch for mental health issues in, because children are kind of all over the map anyhow, right? When it's adults, we look for change. But children are kind of, they're always kind of toing and froing, so we have to have even better eyes on them. But you're going to be looking for, changes in their behavior in terms of, have they become more withdrawn? Are they having more difficulty with transitions? Again, you're comparing this to what a baseline was for them. Are they acting out in school? Are they acting out with peers? Are they acting out with siblings? Are they waking up more often? Are they regressing at all? For example, are you seeing bedwetting where you didn't see that for a long time, or insisting on sort of transitional objects like pacifiers or blankets in a way that they have not been doing for some time? So that's what you're looking for, these kinds of shifts. Are you seeing a pubescent or an adolescent child, again, struggling in school, pulling back, we're again becoming more withdrawn, not coming out of their room? It's tough because, again, adolescents by definition can also get to that place. But if this is also going on at the same time, it's about being very plugged in to noticing these transitions. One bias that sometimes people can run into is that, well, we're doing our divorce great. Our kids are doing just fine. Don't be so sure that. You may think you've got your divorce wired, but it may not necessarily be the case for your child. So any signs and signals you're seeing, even though it seems ostensibly like things are going smoothly, you're not having lots of legal battles and all of that, your child is still may very well be struggling. And that means having relationships with other folks, like your child's teacher. Are they noticing changes there? Watching how they are with peers, even asking if you're friends with the mother of the peer and they're seeing them play together, are they noticing any changes? Just keeping an eye on that through other folks who actually have eyes on your kids and may notice these changes. And kids need routine, and again, divorce can really interrupt routine, but to whatever degree you're able to maintain some kind of routine for your child, it becomes very, very important. Understanding that the younger the child, the less they're going to have words to express what it is they're feeling. And I'm always going to make that, suggestion of also, talking with your pediatrician about, if they're anything that they would recommend knowing your child from a health perspective, or does your child need access to therapy? They often do. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, even at a relatively young age, at a place, where they can talk about their strong feelings, or that they're upset, or maybe even that they feel to blame. But giving your child those kinds of options and opportunities so they have those places, but also keeping a close eye on things. This is a big transition. And also, kids struggle sometimes with that transition of going to their other parent's house and then that transition of coming back into your house. And those transitional nodes can get very complicated, and there's a risk for the parents to start going at each other again. Well, every time they come back from your house, they're this, that, and the other. Well, every time you send them to my house, they're this, that, and the other. And now the child is caught in this tension too, which can take whatever is happening for the child and also magnify it. It's hard to transition between spaces, and this can be it can really be felt significantly by a child.
How much should we be pushing the conversation with our child? I can imagine a teen locking themselves in the bedroom, not wanting to talk about it, closing themselves off, and the parent going, I'm going to give them their space. I'm not going to push the issue. Where is that line of us getting them to open up?
Remember, child, sometimes we have to compare this to a baseline, right? So if you had a kid who was actually very much like present in the
Right.
home, and now you're seeing a change, that's really what we want. We're looking at changes from where they usually were. If they were always locked in their room, even on the best of possible days, maybe this isn't that much of a shift, right?
Right.
You don't get
Right.
into power struggles with them, because right now they feel very out of control and you're not going to win at that. But any possibility before they go and lock into the room, taking that moment and just sort of checking in. And you might get surly one-word answers. Part of that's adolescence. Part of this may be the situation, but it is looking at sort of change. Also, if you can get eyes on how they are doing with peers. Adolescents are interesting because they're often great with their peers or friends, but not with their parents. So you want to make sure that you have that opportunity. If you see them that they're doing fine with their peers, that's a good sign. Doesn't mean that they're not struggling, but that's a good sign. It may be some of the surliness you're seeing is what they save up, what adolescents save up for their parents. But when in doubt, talk with your child and then get in there as early as you can. The earlier we engage in intervention with anyone, whether it's a child, a teen, or an adult, the better the outcomes.
Are there support groups for teens?
That's a good question. Support groups for teens, like some schools are getting better and better and making peer support groups simply part of the curriculum in school. And so I've seen some high schools do that. I absolutely know that there are adolescent clinicians who do run support groups, and they exist. The issue then becomes finding what those are in your area. Sometimes it's a little bit harder because teens are a narrow band of age, right? So
Yes.
because of that narrow band of age, you might not see as many of them, but they definitely exist. And actually it can be a very, very useful technique, very, very useful approach with adolescents who may open up in a different way amongst other teenagers, and also may feel a little bit, quote unquote, more normal because they're watching that other people might be struggling with the same things that they are.
Thank you, Dr. Ramani. That was great. In our next lesson, we're going to be talking about identity and self-concept. You won't want to miss it. So if I believe that based on the way my parents treated me, I was unlovable as a child, then I go through this divorce, and that reconfirms my belief that I'm unlovable.
Absolutely. So I think that idea, that self-concept of I am unlovable. Self-concept is sometimes also called a schema. The schema is, and they tend to be sort of these permanent belief structures that we hold within us. I am unlovable, right? So you might have this moment in time where you did feel lovable in this relationship, but I am unlovable is always hanging in the balance. So when the evidence tilts that way again, you're like,
Yeah.
see, told ya, I am unlovable.
Dr. Ramani, what's the difference between identity and self-concept?
Identity is our sense of self, and it is comprised over the lifespan on the basis, it's very much obviously in childhood, but it's a culmination of experiences, interactions with significant individuals in the person's environment, the child's environment, typically parents or caregivers, their community, the larger society. And identity is, again, how a person views themselves within themselves and also within the world. A healthy sense of identity is stable, meaning that the person consistently views themselves as who they are in a variety of situations. Sort of, they are them, and yes, there's school, and yes, there's life, or there's work, or whatever, there's relationships, but there's a sort of a steady sense of who a person is. The sort of the division between identity and self-concept, it's a blurry distinction at best. I mean, our self-concept is more self-evaluating, if you will. So our self-concept might be whereas our identity could very much begin, who am I? I am a woman, I am a mother, I am a psychologist, I am these things that we sort of, who we are as we go through the world. I am a person who gets frustrated easily. All these things might comprise an identity. Now, self-concept might be more evaluating that. My self-concept is I'm not a good mother, or I'm not a good psychologist, or I'm a great psychologist. So there's an evaluative component to that idea of self-concept, whereas identity is probably more sort of stable, a stable inner core. Now, when identity is stable, it is healthy, but when a person has been through difficult experiences in their life, including trauma or other kinds of, or loss, or even constant invalidating relationships, then what can happen is that sense of identity can get shaped, and a person feels more pressure to be what other people want them to be. So the person no longer has a stable identity. They find themselves constantly shifting to suit the environments they're in.
So in your experience, Dr. Ramani, how have you seen people's self-concept change when they're going through a divorce?
Oh, people's self-concept changes a lot, right? Because your identity might be the same. I am a person, I am a woman, I am a mother, I am a whatever, you're an accountant, whatever you are. But the self-concept of, you might now think, I'm not effective at relationships. I'm not a good communicator.
Yes.
I am not enough. I am not worthy. I wasn't worth not cheating on. Whatever it may be, self-concept can really be negatively shaped. And one's self-concept, and frankly, identity could be, I am a spouse. I am a family person. I belong to a family, right? And now that's all being shifted by these changes in the story. And people will say that shift in self-concept, wait a minute, I'm no longer running a household, I'm in the same way, or I'm no longer the the person who's been married for 30 years to the same person. That changes, and that shift, not only in identity, but at the same time in self-concept, like, who exactly am I? Like, what am I about anymore? I thought I was in this for the long term. Mm-hmm. That can then shift for a person accordingly.
Have you ever seen the self-concept shift positively because they are going through? Yeah, talk about that.
A person can, yes. I mean, we're talking about the tough parts of divorce, but there absolutely can be a positive shift in self-concept. A person might say, now that I'm not married to this person anymore, I'm realizing that I am more independent and skilled and autonomous and effective in the world than I thought. That the kids do great with me, and it was the chaos in the home that was caused in this marriage that was the issue, but actually I feel like I'm thriving as a parent. So absolutely, there could be a shift in self-concept of, I am more effective than I thought, I'm better at this than I thought, I'm better at other things than I thought. So some people might find that the removal of that sort of system, the marital system, from their life can result in a person who now feels more what we call efficacious.
Is it our job to just understand what our self-concept is, or are we supposed to build a stronger, better self-concept?
We want a self-concept that's based in reality.
Ah.
Okay, so people should not be walking around the world saying, I'm great.
Yeah, that's what I was about to do.
I'm the greatest mother. Yeah. I'm the greatest person. We want a self-concept that's accurate, that's based in reality. So a person might say, I'm finding it harder, to balance the kids and work now that I'm no longer in this relationship. You might say, like, I'm getting overwhelmed more easily, like, or that I realize now, like, my self-concept is that I don't do well outside of a relationship. Whatever, how a person's learning things, right? So it's not like I'm great, but we want it to be accurate. So just because a person, for example, an inaccurate self-concept would be someone cheated on you because you're not enough. No, right. People cheat on you because they cheat. Right. Not because you're not enough. That would be, so if the self-concept could shift into, I showed up as my best self, and this was somebody who, for their reasons, went and did what they did. I'm not responsible for their behavior. That's a healthy self-concept.
So if I believe that based on the way my parents treated me, I was unlovable as a child, then I go through this divorce, and that reconfirms my belief that I'm unlovable.
Absolutely. So I think that idea, that self-concept of I am unlovable. Self-concept is sometimes also called a schema. The schema is, and they tend to be sort of these permanent belief structures that we hold within us. I am unlovable, right? So you might have this moment in time where you did feel lovable in this relationship, but I am unlovable is always hanging in the balance. So when the evidence tilts that way again, you're like, see, told you, I am unlovable.
And our job is to recognize that might be our self-concept right now, but it is not based in reality, because we are lovable. If you believe that you are lovable at your core, then it is our job to move from that false self-concept into a realistic one.
Yes, and that's not easy to do, Kyle.
Yeah.
To sort of kind of calibrate our sense of self, our identity, our self-concept, our self-schema is probably some of the hardest work of being a human being. And to see ourselves accurately, most of us look at ourselves in funhouse mirrors all the time. I mean, the work of therapy is to turn it into a normal, healthy mirror. And when we have significant stressors in our life that can ping those old wounds, a great example would be a divorce. Going back into those distorted self-schemas, those distorted self-concepts, that's where that's going to be most pronounced. And so, again, where do we often end up is in therapy, but there are other things like journaling, like really places you can actually be very open and say, no, I actually think I am able to do this. I am good at this, or I may not be good at that. Remember that the self-concept also means of a person saying like, I know I'm not good in a crowd, but I do know I'm a great friend to my friends when I'm one-on-one, right? So it's seeing the whole, a person might say, when I haven't had sleep, I am a difficult person to deal with, so I've got to take care of my sleep, right? It's those sorts of that self-awareness then sort of shapes all of this out, and we can see it more wholly. But unfortunately, I'm going to be frank with you, Kyle, one of the great struggles of being a human being, and especially in the world we're in now, is for people to develop healthy identities and a healthy self-concept. We're not doing enough in the world to foster that in people for a variety of reasons: how we parent, how we educate kids, the sort of the absolute abyss of social media and all the things that people see. That all shapes a sense of I'm not enough. And so getting out of that is no small task, divorce or no divorce.
What do you think about one of the first steps being mindful of our intrusive thoughts and the cognitive distortions that we play through our brains every day?
It's again, we're now back to sort of some of the stuff we were talking about with acceptance and commitment work, is that these things are going to come through, but it's also understanding where do they come from and how do they affect us, right? This is why slowing down. Mindfulness, in essence, is really sort of pulling off on the accelerator. It's slowing down so you can take a second and say, wait a minute, this is that part of me that tells me I can't. And then if we go really deep on this, we're starting to open up sort of the issue of parts work that we see in trauma work, which is these parts of ourselves exist to protect us, right? So that those negative self-harming voices, they're not meant to just be our tormentors. They're meant to be our protectors, but in a really distorted way. Like, you can't go apply for that job. Okay, like, oh sure, you've been married for 20 years, and so an Excel sheet because you could set up lunch dates. You can't apply for that. So that inner voice is telling you don't apply for the job. Yeah. But what is that inner voice also trying to do? It's trying to protect you from failure. And perhaps it was a time in your life where failure meant the anger of your parents or even the anger of a partner. So this angry voice is actually trying to do its best to keep you from those harms, if you will, but in a really kind of mean way. So even within us, there's this sort of models of protecting and persecuting and all of that. So to understand how that's playing within us, that sometimes it even goes beyond our self-concept to being sort of protective in the way we see in people who've been through trauma and loss. So the shift and slowing down and saying, oh, I see where this voice is coming from. And I always say, like, what is the function of that voice? How is that voice protecting you? How is that voice
Good
protecting
question.
you? And when you keep bringing yourself back to that question, because we're always sort of volleying for psychological safety. We as human beings in general want to be safe. When you can understand how these negative voices are protecting you, you might be in a better position to get in there and sort of turn the ship a little bit in terms of how you talk to yourself as you navigate, particularly a very destabilizing process like divorce, where most people who go through this feel like that they failed.
Yeah. Love that. What is this voice trying to protect me from? Is that the question? Is that one of the questions? Yeah. That's good. That's really good, because I think I reached the step of recognizing the voice and then maybe hypothesizing where it came from. But I didn't take that next step of going, yeah, but for what reason? For what reason? That's powerful stuff. Y'all, you better write that down, okay? I hope you got your workbook out. Write that down. Okay, let's talk about kids. This is where self-concept is being developed for the first time. Their parents are now going through this divorce. What can parents do to help them maintain a healthy, realistic self-concept, but also not hurt them in the future for having maybe a self-concept that's skewed in reality?
One of the temptations when a child, when you're trying to be a well-intended parent and your child is going through something, is to maybe overprop them up. You can do no wrong. You're great. Everything's great. Like, I think we've been very much in a sort of everything's great stage. But one of the greatest things a child could also learn is what their strong suits aren't, but in a gentle way. Not because what children learn is when they're not good at something and it's not done right, is you are going to be rejected as a result. You're not going to be loved as a result. It's very much conditional love. But if a child can recognize, there's some things that aren't that, for example, a child who might frustrate easily or something like that, to help them understand, like, give voice to that and say, these things can be hard for you. I know that. And so let's try to figure out a new way versus like, you're perfect. Everyone gets mad, but you're perfect. No, like the frustration and maybe lashing out a sibling or breaking something, that's not okay. So to help give voice to that, but help the child recognize there's a different path, right? So what you don't want to do is let the kid think, well, you're doing no wrong, because again, it's not unusual for a child it's not unusual for a parent to try to overcompensate during the divorce phase because they're trying to protect their child. It's not, you certainly want to help them feel safe. You want them to feel loved, but you also want to keep it real with them, right? So if they're saying, well, I'm not doing my homework and I'm not doing this, you got to do those things. And if you don't, there's going to be a consequence. Those consequences don't go away just because your parents are going through a divorce. You might be able to show them a little bit of grace, but we have to be very careful that we keep our children in this healthy space. And one of the greatest ways to ensure that we're creating healthy self-concept and healthy identity is that sense of unconditional love. Not, you can do anything you want and we're going to applaud you. But whatever you do, even if you make a mistake, we love you. We're here. And we're going to walk you through that. And I think we mishear unconditional love as like, you can do anything and we're going to cheer you on. That's not what it is. It's, I'm here. I love you. This, though, was not okay.
Yeah.
This was not okay. And so let's break this down. Let's figure out what happened here. So the child recognizes that they're not facing rage and rejection and all the rest of that they're still loved and held. However, someone's saying, not cool. You would rather your child learns those lessons from you than from their peers or in a space outside the house. That gets it to be a lot more challenging. But again, divorce really can kind of throw a wrench in the works, because it really does make it, we are often feeling like our child's already going through so much, but it is about keeping the child embedded in reality and doing it in a loving, present way. Keep in mind too, Kyle, one of the biggest mistakes we make, not only with children, I think with adults, is we tend to much more quickly notice the things they do wrong than the things they do right. Mm-hmm. So when your child is getting it right, they're like, hey, dude, look at us, we're getting out the door on time. Like, good for you. That's so great that you did that. Or I saw you playing with your sister. That was lovely that you were doing that. Praising the child when they get things right is how we shape behavior. But too often what a child hears is no, bad, don't. And that is not that's definitely never going to be a good play, right? But when the child is their good stuff is noted, the child just wants more of that. So they're going to, we just, our problem is that we're like, okay, we're having a good day. Don't need to comment on that. Let's just hope this keeps going. It's only going to keep going if we say, hey, thanks, or that was great, or, you did good today. And that makes a big difference. Most kids don't get that.
Oh, no question. When my nephew uses thank you, he's 6, when he uses thank you or please, I always try to go, good job saying that, because everybody else watches him and then he says it and no one says anything. And then when he doesn't say it, everyone jumps down his throat.
Exactly.
You better say thank you. I go, I have an animal training background, so to me, I'm like, reward.
That's exactly
behavior you
right.
want,
Right. No one's ever
Yeah.
trained a dog by beating it.
No.
And so it's so
dog-
yelling at a child only when they get it wrong, or pointing out only what they're doing wrong, it's never going to be a good thing. But again, it's creating that balance so the child can have this very healthy and whole sense of self-appraisal. Or even if and also it could be, let's say your child is, they want to try something new, right? And it's something like they want to try ice skating, and they get on that ice and they fall 27 times. You don't turn around and say, ice skating's not for you. You say, it's tough out there if you keep falling down, but I think it's great that you tried it. Do you want to try it again? Yeah. And so you're saying that you're acknowledging that what they did was tough. It was brave. You're also leaving the door open to whether they want to try it again. And it's very clear that you love them, whether they keep falling or they manage to skate around in a whatever good skating way is.
Not falling. Thank you, Dr. Romney. In this lesson, you have a worksheet, okay? And on the worksheet, I want you to identify your current sense of self in the context of this divorce. There are before, during, and after elements to this worksheet, so just follow those directions. Then list any patterns you see throughout your life and practice the reframing technique worksheet to flip these thoughts and begin to see a new narrative. And now, the final exercise, I love this one. Write one piece of advice you can share with your child as they are navigating big emotions. Now, here's why I like it, because the second part of this exercise is I want you to remind yourself of this piece of advice too, okay? So this is for you and your child. We'll see you in the next lesson, all on expectations and decision making.
So here's the thing. When we set realistic expectations, part of that is accounting for the context. So we might have a set of expectations for what we believe we could do for ourselves, but we have to account that there's now another person in play. And again, in a divorce, no one's bringing their best selves. So this is where people can get really locked into some really tricky situations in divorces when they have an expectation of something that frankly might be very unreasonable and they can't let it go. But you also have to realize that this isn't just about you fighting for what's best for your child and having expectations about that, but recognizing that there's someone else involved in this conversation.
In previous lessons, Dr. Romney, we talked about the need to practice acceptance, and right along with acceptance is managing our expectations. What do you think is most important when setting expectations in our divorce process?
Learn from what you already know. Your expectations have been being calibrated over years. This isn't a new person. You know what things are like. I think one of the hardest things about realistic expectations is that it requires us to look with a clear eye on what's really happening around us. And that can be painful. That can bring up grief. It can even bring up shame. Like, this was really what it was like. Why did I stay in this? What's wrong with me kind of thing. So I think that looking at the expectations clearly can bring up a lot of negative emotions, like, ooh, this was not actually a very nice person, or, oh, this is how they behave in an argument or whatever. So being clear on what is realistic. And part of realistic expectations is also not comparing yourself to other people, because you may have the example of someone else you know who went through a divorce and their experience was very different, and that can skew your expectations. But you don't know everything about their story. They might have lived someplace different. They may have had a different circumstance with sort of the personalities of the people involved. There might have been different resources involved. So when you put all of that together, it also skew our expectations when we do engage in comparison. But in many ways, all of us are very clear on what's realistic. It's just sometimes too painful to accept that that's what it is. And this is where expectations and acceptance are very much locked into a dance with each other.
And when we have our expectations going into the process, we're going to also have to make big decisions. And these big decisions could be on, visitation schedules or, residency locations, whatever they are. Because for me, if I was in this, I would want to make the best possible decision and go for that big, best possible decision, even if I thought it was not going to be the expected decision, because I've set my expectations lower. I go after the big decision anyway.
Right. But
How do I grapple between, what were you about to say?
No, go. Sorry, I didn't interrupt you.
How do I grapple between, I'm going to go after the decision that's best for me and my child, even though I know I should expect to get nothing?
So here's the thing. When we set realistic expectations, part of that is accounting for the context. So we might have a set of expectations for what we believe we could do for ourselves, but we have to account that there's now another person in play. And again, in a divorce, no one's bringing their best selves. So this is where people can get really locked into some really tricky situations in divorces, when they have an expectation of something that frankly might be very unreasonable and they can't let it go. Right? The flexibility of realizing this is the expectation I have is I can get this. More than 50% custody, a very clean financial agreement. They're going to be willing to pay for all this stuff that they've never wanted to pay for in the past. In a way, you're now getting yourself into a place where if you get stuck on that and it's not coming together, then it becomes even all the more difficult to release that, to be flexible and say, this isn't coming together the way I want. So your expectations, again, have to be very shaped by what you know, by the context. You may say, it's better for my child to stay at their school, but the school has tuition associated with it. To which the ex-spouse may say, well, now I'm paying for 2 houses, or I'm paying for 2 sets of living agreements. There's no way we can afford this tuition, but your new place you live is in a place with great public schools, so they can go to that public school. Do you see what I'm saying? And so there's expectations, but there's also, we have to differentiate that from wants and realistic, and realistic gets. So the expectation might be, I want my kid to stay in their same school, but the reality is that that's not going to be possible under these circumstances. And, there's also the situation, maybe there is enough money to pay for it, but the court's going to say, they don't have to pay their tuition. There's a public school where you are, go to it. You want them to go to that school, you pay for it. And I've seen that as something that has come down many, many times. So the expectations, again, have to be formed by what you know, but you also have to realize that this isn't just about you fighting for what's best for your child and having expectations about that, but recognizing that there's someone else involved in this conversation, and they may or may not meet you on that, and you probably know based on the relationship you have had with them. Again, this is sort of where the radical acceptance sort of peers in again, of like, what this is. The painful part is sort of adjusting to that.
Lots of emotions going down in the divorce process. Big decisions have to be made. Is there a way to make these decisions from a healthy, strategic place and not be clouded by our emotions?
One of the important things to do is take advantage of the days when emotions are not high, right? And to be much more clear on what the asks are, the wants are, the expectations are, all of those things, getting that sorted, in essence, sort of codifying it or writing it down. Because when emotions heat up, You want that information to exist in a place where it was devised on a day where it wasn't. For example, you're like, oh, you want that? Well, now I'm going to ask for 10 more of this, which means you're going to end up going backwards in this sort of so-called negotiation process. Another thing that can be very helpful when emotions are running high is to have those advisors you turn to, whether that's an attorney, whether that's a therapist, whether it's a friend you've been talking to, that person where potentially cooler heads can prevail because it's not their emotional state. And they can ensure, because again, when these emotions get frothed up, people might be within inches of what's a reasonable settlement, but the whole thing can get disbanded because people really do allow not only emotion, but ego to enter the process. You're not getting away with that. We're like, oh my gosh, you're $5,000 away and you're about to spend another $10,000 to fix this. And you might lose other things. And so you have to have also realistic expectations around the vindictiveness of the people involved, that if you do go to a bridge too far, that this might put you back 20 more bridges. So but when you are in that sort of emotionally heightened state, this is why people should not be trying to negotiate their divorces by themselves when there is strong emotion in place. It's one thing if it's two reasonable people who are trying to get a divorce. It's quite another if you are arguing over certain things related to money. As soon as the arguments come in, you definitely need someone else to be that touchstone, to be a sounding board, to be the person who sort of pulls you back before you try to make a decision from a place of emotion, which really does not work here.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you for that, Dr. Ramani. Before finally wrapping up step number 2, we have some journal prompts just for you. Number 1, list out your current expectations. Number 2, from that list, identify alternatives you could be flexible with. Number 3, identify your non-negotiables. And finally, follow these steps in varying scenarios based on Dr. Ramani's decision process in order to manage healthy expectations during this turbulent time.